Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started with our June 18th council session. We will begin with a moment of silence. If you are able to stand, please do so. Thank you. So now we will proceed to presentations. The first presentation is a proclamation recognizing the Chesapeake Canine Fund and the contributions they have made to MCFRS by Council Vice President Katz.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'd like to ask Ken Sonner and everyone who's with Ken Sonner to please come down, whether they're on 2 legs or 4 legs, whoever's with Ken Sonner, please. Yeah. Good to see you. Thank you. How are you? We always said black. That's Chief. How are you? Good morning, gentlemen. Ken, I'm going to ask you to please introduce everybody who's here, please.
Good morning. My name's Ken Sonner. I'm with Chesapeake Canine Fund. The fund started in Annapolis to help. We started out by helping the canine officers there in terms of not only replacing dogs, but also with providing equipment. As a native of Montgomery County and also a resident of Montgomery County, we were actually able to extend. We've been helping police departments from as far as Ocean City, Denton, and then recently we've expanded our mission, and we've now started with Montgomery County Fire and Rescue. So I'm going to pass the microphone along. Everyone but Pryor can introduce themselves.
Scott Goldstein, Fire Chief, Mr. Katz.
John Kinsley, I'm the Operations Chief.
Mike O'Neill, firefighter and a canine search specialist with Maryland Task Force 1.
Mike Glazier, Captain with Montgomery County Fire and Rescue and Maryland Task Force 1 Task Force Leader.
Bob Stojanski, Program Manager, Maryland Task Force 1.
Again, thank you all for being here, and it's truly an honor to recognize Chesapeake Canine. The cost, I think it should be noted that the cost associated with law enforcement canine units can be very high. And Montgomery County's canines have truly benefited from Chesapeake's canine fundraising efforts and generosity, as you're going to hear in this proclamation. This is a proclamation from the Montgomery County Council. Whereas in the summer of 2016, the founders of the Chesapeake Canine Fund discussed how to support our local law enforcement community, make an immediate impact on public safety, and highlight a cause that everyone understands and benefits from. And I was going to say, is the chief here? He was. Yep, Chief, can you please join us? I think that would be appropriate. Whereas our first responders who work with canines became the focal point of the organization after realizing the number of times residents rely on these expert units, and whereas the Chesapeake Canine Fund recently raised more than $10,000 through fundraisers and private donations to help offset fundamental and emergency costs associated with canine units in the Chesapeake Bay area, and whereas Maryland Task Force 1, which is headquartered in Montgomery County and part of the FEMA Urban Search and Rescue Task Force, responds to emergencies involving trench collapse, structure and building failures, confined space incidents, urban victim search, and any incident in which their specialized equipment or expertise may be needed, and whereas the Chesapeake Canine Fund outfitted Maryland Task Force 1 with first aid kits, collapsible crates, special ops harnesses, rough wear dog boots, kennel mats, ear and eye protection kits, and emergency cooling vest. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the County Council of Montgomery County, Maryland, hereby recognizes the Chesapeake Canine Fund for the donation of equipment to the Montgomery County Fire and Rescue Service, a FEMA unit. It's presented today, and it's signed by Council President Nancy Navarro and me as Vice President. Congratulations and thank you so much for what you're doing. Would you like to hold the proclamation? We're going to get a picture. And if my colleagues would please stand or come down or whatever you'd like.
Good boy. All right, now we have a proclamation recognizing Sonia Pruitt as the first African-American woman to achieve the rank of captain with the Montgomery County Police Department, presented by Councilmember Will Jawando.
Thank you very much, and Captain Pruitt, come on up. And I want to ask the community engagement family, and if Chief Jones want to come up and support as well, that would be great. So I'm going to say a couple words, and then I'm going to let Captain Pruitt, I still like saying that, make a few comments. I first met Detective Pruitt almost 20 years ago when she was at the 3rd District on Sligo, when I was a AmeriCorps member, and at that time they had a program with the Montgomery County Police Department. So I served, I had my Montgomery County Police ID that year, and I was very excited. And she is one of many, many officers that took me under her wing and showed me the ropes. And so just a point of personal privilege, even though we're here to honor her accomplishments, it's just a real honor to be here this many years later, in no small part because of your mentorship and friendship, you and Daryl McSwain and many others at that 3rd District. So I just want to acknowledge that. And she looks the same. So that's, that I've aged a little bit, but I don't know what happened. The other thing is, I think it's a remarkable thing that here we are in a department that is one of the best in the nation, that is almost 100 years old in a couple of years, and we are going to celebrate and honor today the first African-American woman to ever achieve the rank of captain. And I think it's timely that in a year that we are pursuing legislation here in the council to create a racial equity lens for all of our policy, it's fitting that we would celebrate and that this would happen this year. I know it was not without struggle. You know, you talk about breaking glass ceilings. In law enforcement, there's been a lot of documentation of being a woman in law enforcement itself. Being a black woman is another whole scenario. I'm sure Captain Pruitt will talk about that. But the fact that in 27-year career, she's been able to achieve and serve in so many areas of the department is really a testament to her dedication to this community and her perseverance and her hard work. So before I read the proclamation, I'd like to allow Captain Pruitt to say whatever she'd like to say.
Thank you, and good morning. So Councilmember Jawando has put me on the spot. I was only going to say thank you and hi to all my police family, two of my unit members here, Sergeant Dan Helton and Sharif. I'm going to mess up your last name. I just started, I'm going to have to practice so I won't offend Sharif. But I'm the director of the Community Engagement Division now, and it is it's I don't know what word to use. I'm not going to use bittersweet because it's really not bitter. But let me just tell you a brief story. My son, one of my sons, I have twin sons, they're almost 16 years old. One of them is a really good artist. And so the other day he says to me, I'm going to draw a comic strip and you're going to be one of my superheroes in the comic. And I said, oh, that's great, you know. He says, don't you want to know what your superpower is? I was like, okay, what's my superpower? He says, you have the ability to burst into flames and then walk through fire without any damage to you. And I was like, okay. And he says, Ma, that's how I see you. And so it has been a long 27 years, I have to admit. I have purposefully did a variety of things in the police department because I wanted to see how the police department works. And the best way to do that is to have a variety of assignments. My resume was so long that when I applied for captain, I had to shorten it by 2 pages because the system will only take 4 pages. And I say that because here it is almost 100 years after the department was founded and 156 years after the first black woman was hired as a police officer in this country. And we're still seeing firsts in Montgomery County. It's not an easy road for black women in the police department, not just ours, but all over the country. Although I would say that we're perfect for policing. We come from, my ancestors are from West Africa. So we came here as slaves, and then we took care of our families, and we took care of the master's family. We earned the most advanced degrees in this country. We do things like carry a whole voting block because that's who we are, and we want to be identified and acknowledged for that strength and not tamped down because of it. We're not arrogant. We're not aggressive. We don't talk too much. What we say and what we see are important. We have a great vantage point that everyone should want to know about and want us to share because it's important. And so I stand here before you. I'm proud to be a member of the police department. My father was an MP in the Army, and then he served his whole career in D.C. as a police officer. So it's part of my legacy. I love it. And I'm here to serve you. It's my commitment and my job. My second son, Marshall, said to me, Mom, you're going to be the director of community engagement. Oh, my God, they're going to love you. Because he knows that that's where my heart is with the people. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you for Sharif, pray for me. And thank you, Montgomery County, and thank you, Will.
And thank you. We're gonna get another round of applause because I'm gonna let the chief, who became acting chief last week, which is a big accomplishment itself, to say a few words as well.
So good morning, and just briefly, I just want to say how proud personally I am of Sonia and this accomplishment. She is correct. It is for any officer, it's really a challenge, and it speaks volumes to accomplish the rank of captain as we go through the ranks. It's a very tedious process that people have to do a lot of preparation for. It does require a lot of commitment and dedication. Sonia is one of our most committed and dedicated employees, and I will say over the past few years is just to see her grow in the ranks of the executive staff has been tremendous. So we really do appreciate Sonia, and like I said, we are very proud of her, and we look forward to some continued success. So thank you very much.
All right, we've started this new yellow light, so I got to hurry up and read this here. The County Council of Montgomery County, Maryland proclamation. Whereas, you come next to me here. Sonia Y.W. Pruitt has been a sworn officer with the Montgomery County Police Department, MCPD, for nearly 30 years, serving her community in a variety of roles, including duty commander, deputy district commander for the 1st and 5th districts, deputy director of the Internal Affairs Division, and as administrative lieutenant for the Patrol Services Bureau, where she managed the School Resource Officer Program. And whereas on March 3rd, 2019, Captain Pruitt made history by ascending to the rank of captain within MCPD, becoming the first African American woman to achieve that rank in the department's more than 97-year history. And whereas for 20 years, Captain Pruitt has served on the National Black Police Association as a member, a board member, vice chair, and currently as chair, and has spoken on a variety of law enforcement-related issues both in the United States and internationally through print media, radio, and television. And whereas Captain Pruitt believes that one of the roles of African American officers in policing is to provide an authentic community policing model for residents, particularly young people with whom they come into contact, and believes that officers should be able to work at the level of their greatest potential without losing themselves in the process. And whereas Captain Pruitt is a proud Howard University alumna,
Hey, Jude.
where she majored in microbiology and holds a Bachelor of Science degree in criminal justice from the University of Maryland and a master's in forensic psychology from Argosy University. And whereas Captain Pruitt serves as an inspiration to us all, but especially to young women of color, as this achievement represents a lifetime of hard work, sacrifice, and service to her community. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the County Council of Montgomery County, Maryland hereby congratulates Captain Sonia Y.W. Pruitt for being the first African-American woman to achieve the rank of captain with the Montgomery County Police Department, and for her continued dedication to the residents of our county. Presented on this day, the 18th of June, in the year 2019, signed by myself and our Council President, Nancy Navarro. Congratulations. All right, let's take a picture.
Wonderful. So now we're on to general business. Are there any announcements, Ms. Paradise, or any petitions?
Yes, good morning. We have an addendum to the agenda today, adding a proposed closed session immediately following the afternoon public hearings to discuss planning board appointments. And the council received one petition from residents of Montgomery County supporting ZTA 1901, accessory residential uses, accessory apartments, with 218 names.
Thank you. So the minutes of May 9th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, and 20th, 2019 have been distributed to all council members. Are there any edits? Hearing none, those minutes are approved. Okay, so I need a motion for consent calendar. Councilmember Rice, seconded by Council Vice President Katz. Okay, I don't see any lights. It's very short consent calendar, 3 items. Council member. We're doing the minutes. No, we're doing consent calendar. Consent calendar. All right. Okay, all those in favor, please raise your hand. The consent calendar has been adopted. All right, now we're on to legislative session. This is day 13th. And we have a number of bills for introduction. The first bill is Bill 14-19, Policing Advisory Commission, established. Lead sponsor, Councilmember Reamer, and co-sponsor, Councilmember Jawando. A public hearing is scheduled for July 9th, 2019 at 7:30 p.m. Councilmember Reamer.
Thank you, Council President Navarro. Well, Montgomery County is a community that provides leadership on many important issues. And we have an opportunity to strengthen police work by building greater community support. I know that we have an excellent police department full of conscientious and highly professional public servants, some of whom were with us here today. But we are obviously not immune as a county, as a department, from the challenges that communities are experiencing all over the country. That is why today I'm introducing legislation with Councilmember Jawando that is supported by the NAACP, the Identity, Casa de Maryland, the ACLU, Jews United for Justice, and many other groups to establish a policing advisory commission, the goal of which is to improve community trust in police work and to strengthen the mission of public safety. The commission would allow for civilian participation in police department policy formulation, using data and focusing on best practices and strengthening the council's oversight role. Unlike civilian oversight boards in other jurisdictions, this commission would not address disciplinary matters. It would not review complaints about an officer or investigate a police-involved incident. While those are crucial matters, Maryland state law denies a body like this jurisdiction over personnel matters. Instead, this commission would focus on the policies that could prevent those incidents from occurring in the first place. For example, community policing. How can we be more of a community police force? De-escalation training. Is our program a best practice, and is it well implemented? Traffic stops. What are the outcomes from traffic stops? What does the data show? What is the cost and benefit of this program? There is no doubt that issues like these are appropriate for public discussion and oversight. In fact, given the profound consequences of police action, there's nothing more deserving of public discussion and oversight. Historically, these kinds of policy issues are often addressed internally at the department, with the police leadership making policy decisions without as much oversight from the county executive and the council or input from the public as should be the case. That is where a commission comes in. With members drawn from residents who are experts in criminal justice policy, as well as representing communities that have not always been heard on police issues, this body would meet and deliberate over policy matters that are of significant public concern. Researchers would support the work of the commission to ensure a data-driven conversation. The commission would make recommendations to the department and the council. A great example of this approach is successfully operating in Sacramento today, where the initiative has earned support not only from community groups, but also the department. I look forward to working through the legislative process with my council colleagues. Again, I want to really acknowledge and express my appreciation to Councilmember Jawando for his leadership on criminal justice issues and his work with me in formulating this legislation. And I look forward to the public hearing that will be coming in July. Thank you.
Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Council President, and thank you, Councilmember Reamer, for your leadership on this bill. And I'm very happy to be a co-sponsor, and I hope other colleagues will join us as well. I think it's, what we've been trying to do here. My first bill, 3 weeks after we were sworn in, was related to building trust and transparency between law enforcement and the community. We had a public forum last week that really demonstrated, I think in a really powerful way, that depending on who you are, policing is experienced differently in this county, and that's not different than any other place in the United States, but it's a challenge to us at a critical moment in time when we're hiring a new police chief for the first time in over 15 years, where we have a new council and executive to look at some of this disparate data in a critical way with people from our community and have that type of involvement and dialogue. And so I think this bill is a great step in the direction of helping to create that conversation. You mentioned Sacramento. I think of the dozens of recommendations that came from that commission, many of them were jointly agreed upon between the department and the community members, and that's important. Our goal here is to make sure that police can do their jobs to protect and serve us, and that the community feels safe. And I think this type of community involvement will help that happen. The ability to analyze data, consider best practices from other jurisdictions, and make recommendations and monitor progress, because accountability is important, will help everyone have more faith and confidence no matter who you are and where you live in this county. So I'm proud to be a co-sponsor and look forward to working with you throughout the legislative process, Councilmember Reamer and the rest of our colleagues, to get this passed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I want to thank Councilmember Reamer as well as all the community members who've been working on this particular proposal for quite a while, also with Councilmember Jawando. I know Councilmember Reamer, we did have some conversations, and I sent out some information about looking at what we had in place, because we do have a criminal justice coordinating commission to see whether we could adapt that instead of creating a brand new body. The executive has indicated that it's best to proceed with creating a new body, and so this is why we're here, to work through this, and I look forward to the different sessions, committee sessions, in order to come to a, I think, productive outcome on this area, in this particular arena. I think it's overdue. We do need it, and so thank you so much for leading in that respect. Councilmember Hucker.
Thank you, Madam President. I just want to commend both of you for your activity and leadership on this, and ask to be added as a co-sponsor.
Councilmember Glass.
I too thank my colleagues for their work and would like to be a co-sponsor to legislation 1419, Bill 1419.
Excellent. Wonderful. So now we are on to 3B, Expedited Bill 15-19, Contracts and Procurement, Minority-Owned Businesses, Sunset Date Amendments. Lead sponsor, it's Council President at the request of the County Executive. There's a public hearing scheduled for July 9th at 1:30 p.m. Also for introduction, item C, Expedited Bill 16-19, Special Capital Improvements. Oh, we do have a light for, Councilmember Rice, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And just very briefly, I know that this is a bill sent over by the county executive, but I did want to touch on this issue, and I hope that when we're taking this up, that this won't just be pro forma. I know that you, Madam President, before I got to the council, had focused on this issue of minority-owned businesses and procurement. When I joined the council, I took up the mantle as well, and we worked together on a number of different initiatives along with Mr. Drummer. And this is something that I think warrants, in the context of us when we're talking about our racial equity and social justice lens, looking at something that's a bit more urgent than 2 years out, for us to make sure that we're answering some of the challenges that minority businesses still face when it comes to doing business with our local government. And so I think that while the county executive certainly has expressed some concern about getting an expedient report in terms of a disparity study, I think that the Griffin and Strong report still stands in terms of where things were. I would counter that I don't think that a lot of businesses have said that things have gotten much better for them when it comes to the climate. And so from that perspective, I would hope and urge that we do a 1-year sunset instead of a 2-year sunset, understanding what needs to happen. It would be my hope that the county executive would actually send over a supplemental to get this report underway. This is important for us. It's really important for our local businesses that continue to struggle. And as we know, small businesses are the lifeblood of Montgomery County, and we have a lot of our immigrant population who's coming in and looking to try and forge a way. We need to make sure that we're partnering with them. And so from that perspective, I look forward to working with the GO committee and Fed committee as we take this up, because I really do think this is incredibly important for us. So thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Councilmember Rice, for your leadership on this issue as well. And as you recall, it was the council that added the funds needed for the report last time. This time around, it was not included in the budget request, and obviously, the council, struggles with trying to fund all of our priorities. So we will be looking at this very carefully and taking into consideration what you just said, because it is really critical at a time of transition to ensure that this program is as strong as it can be. Really do appreciate your comments. Item C is expedited Bill 16-19, Special Capital Improvements Project, Goody Landfill Remediation. The lead sponsor is Council President at the request of County Executive. Public hearing action is scheduled for June 25th, 2019 at 1:30 p.m. Bill 18-19, Landlord-Tenant Relations, Relocation Expenses. Lead sponsor, Councilmember Jawando. Public hearing is scheduled for July 16th, 2019 at 1:30 p.m. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Council President. And just briefly, I'm very happy to today be introducing my second bill, Bill 1819, Landlord-Tenant Relations Relocation Expenses. This bill would require a landlord to pay a tenant a relocation payment if the tenant's housing is condemned as unfit for human habitation under certain circumstances, and would require a landlord to provide a tenant with a right of first refusal to reoccupy the property if it is rehabilitated. This is not a theoretical piece of legislation. We had folks that lived in the enclave, which some of you probably noticed is being sued, rightly so, by our Department of Housing and Community Affairs for the thousands of violations, some of which were so bad that apartments had to be condemned. And we had people that had to move out and that had to do so at their own expense. And I don't have to tell you, if you're living, unfortunately, there's sometimes a correlation between affordable housing and not very good housing. And that was the case here. And so you have people that are already rent burdened, housing burdened, having to dip into savings they probably don't have to move for a problem that's not their fault. And this would bring us in line with neighbors such as the District of Columbia and others that have this type of legislation and reimbursement, and equally importantly, right to come back after the problem is fixed, because if you are on the lower end of the rental scale or not, finding another place can be difficult. And you don't want to create the environment where someone could purposely let the property go bad, kick out a tenant, and then fix it up and bring someone else back. So it does two things: relocation expenses and the right of first refusal. This is an opportunity to correct a situation that many Montgomery County families face. We actually had testimony yesterday in the Fed committee from the Department of Housing, who are really looking forward to having this authority as an ability to use in their negotiations with landlords, many of whom are doing the right things. I think this will be an incentive to continue doing the right thing and not let properties go by the wayside. Once all the repairs are completed, allowing tenants the right of refusal is important. Most people want to return to their homes. They've lived there for years. They want to come back. Those who oppose this bill would say it places a financial hardship on landlords, but I would say if a landlord is committed to providing safe housing and following all the county codes, you won't have a problem. And so, again, this brings us in line with our neighbors. And this is not just a housing issue. It's a health and safety issue. It's a moral issue. No one in Montgomery County should have to live in housing that's not habitable. That's not who we are, and it's not what we stand for. So I appreciate. I think Councilmember Katz is a co-sponsor, Vice President Katz. So I'm sorry it's not listed, and look forward to working through this legislation with my colleagues, and also want to congratulate Councilmember Hucker on his bill allowing tenants to break their lease, passing through the Fed committee unanimously yesterday. And this is also a related issue. So thank you very much.
Councilmember Hucker.
Thank you, Madam President. I just want to be added as co-sponsor to this fine piece of legislation.
Thank you. I'd like to be added as a co-sponsor as well. Thank you. Okay. This brings us to item F. Yes. Did I skip item D? I did. I skipped item D. But first, let me go to Councilmember Rice.
I'd just like to be added as a co-sponsor as well, Madam President.
Excellent. That's for Bill 18-19. Yes, she just made that note. Okay, so item D is expedited bill 17-19, bond authorization, stormwater management lead sponsor, council president at the request of the county executive. Public hearing action is scheduled for June 25th, 2019 at 1:30 p.m. All right, so now we're on to item F. This is expedited bill 19-19, economic development, workforce development amendments. Lead sponsor is council president, myself, as well as co-sponsor councilmember Jawando. Public hearing is scheduled for July 16, 2019 at 1:30 p.m. And just to quickly describe this particular bill, will be able to allow us, the council, authorize us to designate either a nonprofit corporation or a public educational institution or both as the county's workforce development organization. So basically, that's all it does. At this particular moment in time, we don't have the flexibility of designating a institution of a public educational institution, only a nonprofit. So this is what this bill does. It's very specific to that particular flexibility. So that's introduced. Councilmember Beamer.
Thank you, Council President. I would like to be added as a co-sponsor on the designation legislation that you just described. And we had a great discussion at Joint Fed EC earlier in the year about how we could build more of a partnership with higher education institutions and workforce development enterprises. And I really I applaud this initiative to open the door to a more specific partnership with those organizations. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Madam President, for your leadership on this particular bill. I would also like to be listed as a co-sponsor.
Thank you. Councilmember Rice.
Ditto.
Wonderful. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Council President, and just wanted to chime in, and I think this, to Councilmember Reamer's point, will provide us with the needed flexibility to make sure our workforce system and continuum, much of which is already done by our great institution of higher education here in the county, or one of them, Montgomery College, also University of Shady Grove. It gives us the flexibility we need to ensure that that system is working. And I'm really glad the colleagues have supported it, and I look forward to moving it forward and discussing what that'll mean in the coming years, in the year or so. So thank you very much.
Councilmember Katz.
And I'd like to be listed as a co-sponsor, please.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I only add that this is one more important step in how this particular county council has really owned the need to align our workforce development with our economic development needs, working in partnership with our business community as well as all our residents. We really do need to get to a point where our model is aligned and it's coherent and can be scalable. So this was one more step towards that. And I am very excited about the energy that is contained in this particular council to really reach that very important point of having a model and a system that works for us here in the county. So really appreciate the support. All right, so now we're going to move to item number 4. This is district council session. And item 4A is a zoning text amendment that 19-01, accessory residential uses, accessory apartments. The Fed committee recommends approval as amended, and we will today have a work session. We also have already scheduled an additional work session on July 9th to begin to review committee work today. And before I turn it over to the chair of the Fed committee so that he can walk us through this proposal, of which he has led both in sponsoring the ZTA, but also in a lot of work that the Fed committee has put into it. Want to acknowledge Councilmember Jawando and Councilmember Friedson for their hard work as well. Let me just say that, change is difficult. I think that our county has definitely changed, and the demographic patterns require us to be open and proactive in how we address the evolved needs of our residents. We continue to need a comprehensive and coherent housing policy that is integrated into a beefed-up transportation infrastructure that has at its core a well-thought-out public transit system. We have made progress, but we are far from that ideal. But in the meantime, we must do something. The narrative that has gained traction in the public sphere about this particular ZTA around a binary, rich and poor, black and white, immigrant, non-immigrant, and some of the things I have read as feedback have been, quite frankly, racist and appalling. This is not who we are. It is surprising because the yield from this ZTA is not going to materially impact the dire need for affordable housing. We are not talking about a whole lot of ADUs. What we are talking about, from my perspective, is yet another attempt to particularly serve two populations, the young, especially millennials, and our aging population as our elderly confront options for life after retirement, including aging and placed in their homes. We know that housing affordability can be an issue for many young people who are starting off and would like to live in our county. We know that many of our elder residents have homes that have risen in value beyond what they can afford in terms of taxes and upkeep. It seems to me that this proposal would meet that need. We should be open to an initiative that seeks to relax rules for building ADUs. Despite the heated rhetoric in some of the feedback we have received, we've also benefited from a lot of thoughtful responses and suggestions for moving forward. Change is not easy, and that is why we must proceed in a thoughtful, measured fashion. The Fed Committee has had 2 sessions, and we had a long public hearing on the subject on February 26th. I'm looking forward to this particular work session, and it is my expectation that we will have another one before taking final action on this ZTA. I thank everyone for participating in this debate. I look forward to more engagement as we go through this. I do encourage my colleagues to share any recommendations or amendments they may have on this ZTA. And once again, I want to thank Councilmember Reamer for his leadership on this issue, and I will now turn it over to him in order to walk us through what the Fed Committee has recommended, as well as amendments that any of my colleagues may have to best put forth an important component, once again, of the diverse housing types that we need in this county to really address the need throughout. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to you, Council Member.
Thank you, Council President Nancy Navarro. Your remarks framed this issue just right, and I really appreciate your setting the table as you have done. As we begin, I'm going to first, just as an administrative matter, pass out a sheet of paper for my colleagues that kind of is intended to help list the various decision points of the packet. The packet has a lot of information in it, and I know we're all reading it, and this is just intended to help keep us on track. The goal for today, and that'll come around to staff, for Jeff and Pam, the goal for today is to have a discussion. There's really no, I think it's not needed for us to make motions, to have straw votes at this point. I think we're just trying to all get really more familiar with the many substantive points here, and of course express views on those points as council members so choose. The goal of the bill, as Council President expressed, is to create new opportunities for people to live in Montgomery County. Our region is growing, and if our rules make it impossible to build new housing, then the options that we have are just going to grow more and more expensive. That is what is happening today, and the middle class is being priced out of this county. Accessory dwelling units could be one small piece of the solution. It is not a revolutionary proposal. It is not going to profoundly change Montgomery County one way or the other. It is a targeted and tailored solution. It would allow housing in certain circumstances, and it will allow many families to figure out how to make it work in an expensive place and how to take advantage of the amazing job opportunities, schools, and quality of life that we've built here. So I really want to thank the hundreds of people who've participated in this discussion from every perspective. Your participation has made this zoning change proposal much better. The committee's work was very strong. I really can't speak, I can't express my appreciation enough for Council Members Friedson and Jawando. The work, the contributions that you made to this have been material. And again, you made the proposal much better than it was as introduced. I want to just say, and I'll try to be brief on this topic, but we've received several letters from the county executive about the issue. Our council staff actually prepared a memorandum that looked into a number of the factual misstatements in the letters that we've received from the county executive. I think it is regrettable that there has been information put out there that is having the effect of stirring up public opposition without a real factual basis. A couple of examples: stormwater. The assertion has been made numerous times that there are no stormwater rules. In fact, there are stormwater rules, the same stormwater rules that apply to accessory structures, to renovations, to tear downs, to any type of construction would apply to accessory dwelling units. The assertion that these would be allowed for short-term rental, for Airbnb, there is specific legislation, language in the zoning change that would not allow them to be used for short-term rental. For some reason, this assertion has continued to be made. And I think a real low blow, using the word trailers to refer to accessory dwelling units, was just so unfortunate. A trailer is definitionally a temporary housing unit. It does not have a permanent foundation. Our zoning code only allows for housing with a permanent foundation to be inhabited and licensed. So it's these statements have served to create a lot of public confusion and anxiety, but we have continued to have a substantive and collaborative discussion, seeking feedback. We've heard from many neighbor communities that have concerns about the use of rental housing in residential neighborhoods. And as a result of those concerns that we heard, the County Council just added 3 positions to the Department of Permitting Services to conduct code enforcement and inspections in residential neighborhoods for residential properties. So that is just one example of the ways in which we are listening, I think, in a genuine spirit of trying to understand and trying to fashion solutions as we seek to move forward. So we have a very complex packet. As the council president said, what I'm going to seek to do is kind of guide the staff's presentation of the substance in the packet. There are about 13 decision points that are highlighted as issues in the packet, and then there's reference to possible future bills. I think it is possible that we could get through all 13 in a couple hours. We'll see how the conversation goes. I think that the ideal scenario would be that council members would ask informational, clarifying questions as we go, and then circle back. But you know, the door is open to council members however they should wish to express themselves or ask questions. So why don't we begin? Again, I think given the volume of communication on this issue and the amount of discussion that we've had, I don't think we need to go back to the beginning. I think we can assume a general understanding and facility of the broad concepts, and we can get into the substance of the proposal. So I'm going to turn to Jeff Zients and Pam Dunn. Jeff, thank you for your work. You've been working on this issue probably more than you'd like for a number of months, and really appreciate what you've done, and Pam as well, and the planning board. We did have a public hearing. We had multiple Fed sessions. The planning board had work sessions and a public hearing. There's been quite a lot of public discussion about this. It's one of the issues that has been talked about probably more than almost any other this year. So, Jeff.
I'd like people to pay attention to page 4 of the memo, which starts the 13 issues that the chairman mentioned. And the first issue is sort of a big one. One of the changes in the ZTA was that it would allow detached.
Okay, so we're on page 4.
Page 4.
This is the first issue now. I'd like to say I think that philosophically or from a big picture level, this one and number 4 kind of go together. Is should detached be allowed? Should there be a minimum lot size? You know, those two things are closely correlated. So I'd recommend that as we talk about this one in the big picture level, we talk about item number 1 and number 4 together. Jeff, can you please explain the facts?
Right. Certainly, today the minimum lot size goes with the minimum lot required in the zone in which a detached unit is allowed. So it's only allowed in RE1, RE2, and the larger lot zones, which have a 1 acre minimum.
Okay, so today, accessory dwelling units that are detached. Detached is a funny word, but we mean the backyard cottages, the garage conversions, the other units that are not attached to the house. Those are only allowed today where?
In large lot zones.
In large lot zones, which is R200?
No, RE1,
RE1,
RE2, R2C.
Okay.
Which all have minimum 1 acre.
And they all have minimum 1 acre. So if you want to build one of those units today, you have to be there with that lot size.
Right. So these smaller lot zones have much smaller minimums. R60 is 6,000 square feet, R90, 9,000, R200, 20,000. Now, the fact that you have those minimums doesn't mean that there are some lots that are at least 1 acre. So you have those too.
Right. So a primary goal of this legislation was to allow for those types of units. That if you have a garage, because your house was built with a freestanding garage on the property, you could put a person in that garage rather than a car. That was a primary goal in drafting this legislation. If you wanted to build a backyard unit for whatever purpose, consistent with the licensing allowance, you would be allowed to do that. So that is why this is the first item on this agenda, because today, to build a backyard unit, you have to be in a large lot zone with at least an acre of property.
And
okay.
The totality of these zones is about 72,000 acres. The distribution on lots by zone is on the bottom of page 4. About 38,000 in R200, 28,000 in R90, and 55,000 in R60.
Okay, so this is one of the most meta issues of the discussion, so we'll turn it to council members for questions and discussion.
Vice President Katz.
Thank you very much, Madam President. So, Jeff, for the 37,900 lots that are in the R200 zone, they're what, 20,000 square feet a lot?
At least.
Do we know how many of those are actually 1 acre?
I think so, but I'm not sure. Let me.
Well, if not, then that would be one of my questions. I'd like to know how many 1 acre lots we would have in the various zones that exist today.
Would be allowed according to, is that what you're asking?
Right. Well, I can clarify. If what I'm asking is that any of the lots that we're talking about, the R90 and R60, how many 1 acre lots would be in you got me, R90 and R60? And also, what does the word attached mean? If I have that separate, what I used to always call a Fonzie suite, you have a garage with somebody living over top of it. For those of us old enough to, some of us aren't old enough to remember. There's antenna TV. You can catch it in the evenings, but it wasn't that bad. Come on, give me a deal. But yeah, okay.
Do it on the radio.
yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's neat. Yeah, but anyhow, if someone takes a separate building, a separate garage or whatever, and takes a 2x4 and connects it to the main house, is that considered attached or detached?
Oh, it depends upon the significance of the connection. If you have a covered causeway,
Yep.
it might be connected. DPS is here really to answer that question as well. It depends upon the significance of the connection, but generally, a attached unit does not have 4 independent walls. So it is physically 3 walls and the third might have been an exterior wall to the existing unit. A detached unit generally has 4 new exterior walls.
Okay. And does permitting agree with that? Is that the way you see that?
An attached building would be as long as there is conditional space. It cannot be a breezeway. It has to be part of the principal structure.
So even if it's a breezeway, that's still not attached?
It's not
it would be
attached.
2 separate buildings with a breezeway is what you're saying?
Right. It would be 2 separate buildings.
Thank you. Just for clarification. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Albornoz.
All right. Thank you, Madam President. I want to begin by really thanking my colleagues on the Fed Committee, and I've had many conversations with Councilmember Reamer about this. In principle, I do support ADUs. I have shared with him and some of my colleagues that my grandparents were able to continue to afford to live in their home longer than they otherwise would have been because of their fixed incomes, because of the ADU that they had in their basement. And while by and large they had pretty good luck with the renters, they primarily focused on graduate students. My concern or reservation is regarding the detachment within some of these smaller lots. And my concern is on several folds. One, and I do appreciate the efforts to try and address and beef up the code enforcement as it currently stands with the addition of the positions. But there is great confusion because there are multiple county agencies that are involved in the permitting process to secure any building permits. But with regards to detached units, you've got Department of Housing, Department of Permitting, and because of the traffic enforcement issues, law enforcement also involved as well, which sometimes leads to confusion. And I did also go out along with some of my other colleagues and meet with civic associations and didn't hear a great deal of feedback regarding current issues, particularly on smaller lots where people are building attachments onto their home and disregarding our current policies and really not feeling comfortable or safe bringing up those issues with their neighbors, often frail and elderly, often in communities of working class, where there are a number of issues that have arisen. And so while I very much appreciate and respect that we are making a change here, I feel uncomfortable with the pace at which we are proposing this particular legislation. And so I'm hopeful that over the course of this work session, over the course of this work session and the next work session, we'll find a sweeter spot. Because I do think that on the whole, there's a lot of good here. There's a lot of positive. But I am concerned about the potential disruption to communities, the potential pitting of neighbors against neighbors, and acknowledging that not every neighborhood is quite the same with regards to its landscape and its infrastructure as it currently stands. And so I have a problem with detachment sort of period, but I am willing over the course of the work sessions to talk about the size and scope if we can't get to a place where detachment is or isn't an issue. But I just wanted to state that up front and share a little bit of my context and perspective based on the conversations I've had with residents, but also the advocates in favor of ADUs as well, because we do need creative solutions to address the complex housing needs in the county. And I do think after these 2 work sessions, we'll be in an even better spot than we are now. And I think we're starting from really solid ground thanks to the hard work of the Fed Committee.
Thank you, Councilmember Albornoz, and thank you for those comments, because actually, at least for me, this is a recurring issue. And I know that NACO awarded the county a particular recognition because of the community action teams that I proposed, and then we passed legislation. And it was really due to the fact that we do have already a lot of chronic issues in our neighborhoods. And so the issue of enforcement, it's going to be really important. Luckily, we do have this vehicle that we need to strengthen. And as we work through this ZTA, we need to address that as well. Because we cannot fool ourselves, number one, and think that it's not already happening, right? It is. I mean, this is how a lot of families are able to afford to live in Montgomery County. But it is also very true that because there has not been the investment, and I will have to say that this council has responded and has added funding for code enforcement, but we do have a model, and that model actually was tested in my district as I proposed it, and it worked very well. So we do have a model, and as we work through this, particular ZTA, and that's why we're going to take our time, I do expect to be able to, include and call for resources to strengthen those community action teams. That, I think, has to go hand in hand, as you were discussing. But this is not a new issue, and we do need to recognize that as well.
I totally appreciate that. I did have one question, and I'm sure there will be many over the course of the conversation over these work sessions, but with regards to the stormwater issue and detachment, I acknowledge and appreciate what Councilmember Reamer talked about with regards to current code enforcement with as we expand homes. But if I could get a little bit more information on what exact analysis has been done as part of this CTA. So for example, if a hypothetical situation ensues where a homeowner has somebody that builds a detached unit on either side of their home, have we looked at analysis on the possible impacts of stormwater management beyond just the one home that may pursue or move forward with the detached property?
I can speak to what we do currently. If you come as far as if you want to build an accessory behind the main building, we follow Chapter 9, the sediment control, and what we take into consideration is how much land disturbance is occurring on the property. If it's more than 5,000 square feet or 100 cubic yard of dirt is going to be moved from the property, they need to obtain a sediment control permit. And once you obtain a sediment control permit, then all the regulations applies. That's when we look at the stormwater runoff, how you have to control the water on your land, not to disturb the adjacent properties. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Sort of. So I guess have you thought through if there are multiple properties within a small block, for example, that are all moving forward? If there are 2 or 3 properties within the same block, does that have any impact on potential sediment control beyond what's currently in the code currently?
No, it's not. Every lot, it would be they need to obtain their own building permit, and it would be looking at it separately. We were not combining, 2 properties. So each building has to meet the current regulations.
And the provision of the addition of sewer and water and all the other accoutrements that would have to come with the detached unit would
right,
also
absolutely.
apply.
That would be WSSC. So even for electrical, they have to have their own separate meters. They have to have water, sewer connections. Those are all part of, reviewing that building. But as far as looking at it for land disturbance, if it doesn't meet that threshold of 5,000 square feet of disturbance or 100 cubic yard of dirt being removed, it's not going to apply to look at the stormwater or the runoff or anything like that, or how you're going to control the water on site.
And a question for my colleagues on the committee. I think you guys did a good job beginning to address the issues of privacy and having the entrance be on the opposite side, not the side adjacent to the neighboring property or windows. But was there a discussion regarding the requirement of fences for detached units? And what was the outcome of that discussion or deliberation?
That was a specific, I don't think we considered. Councilmember Friedson had talked about
if Jeff could weigh in, because, sorry, thanks for yielding. We did discuss fences at the broader topic of privacy, which is a concern that many, particularly in the particularly small R60 zones, had raised. We discussed how to address the privacy issue, ultimately came up with the windows and doors facing inward and not outward. There was a concern, I think, that was raised of how the fence requirement would work, but if Jeff or Pam could speak to that, because this was discussed during committee, and I had an interest in requiring the fence, and we backed away from it based on your expertise of explaining why that could be problematic. So
Right. No, nobody actually made a motion.
it wasn't formally proposed, but it was discussed.
Right. Part of the routine was involved, part of the discussion was involved in allowing existing structures to convert. And you did two issues. One was, what happens if I want to add height to that building, or what happens if I want to add a window facing my neighbor? If a window facing your neighbor existed on the structure now, you allowed that window to exist and the conversion to take place. If you then allowed a fence to that, it might be problematic to light and air for that window. So there was no decision to require a fence either for that existing structure or for a new ADU. A new ADU detached would have to meet setback requirements and would be a little bit less problematic.
Yeah, and the main issue that we talked about here was related primarily, and what I've heard the most concerns about is the existing structures and converting an existing structure. You know, with the setback requirements, you could build a renovation or a knockdown to the setback requirements already. It was the existing structure post 2012 that, you know, is part of the legislation, and whether or not that would have a privacy concern, we ultimately can't. I didn't make the formal motion. We discussed the fence, and the reason why we didn't do it is there were concerns that, you know, were raised about how that would work and whether or not that would create other problems that wouldn't exist. And with the, you know, the existing structure and the windows of, you know, not requiring them to board up the windows, you know, one of the, you know, the kind of the basic premise, at least that the committee had discussed, just to summarize, is, you know, the kind of the idea that, you know, if we're allowing a structure for a car, you know, we should allow it for a human being, you know, as a, you know, a place to live. So if the window is already there and you can, you know, have your car be there and you can be in it with your car, you know, the same kind of privacy issue would already exist. And so we're not adding a privacy concern. But if you create a new window or a new entrance as part of the conversion, that's where it becomes problematic, because you're making a change to the structure. And so that's why we required any new entrance or new window to face inward, the way that we thought that we could thoughtfully address the privacy concern that was raised.
If I may suggest, of course, you could require a fence for a new structure and not require it for a existing structure if you want.
I'm definitely interested in that. As you guys know, I have 4 kids under the age of 11. So we put a 6-foot fence in between our lots, more for privacy for our neighbors, frankly, than for us, and to stop some of the balls from flying over to our neighbor's house. And I will say that fence has really been helpful for both parties and helped in a variety of different ways. So that is something I'm interested in exploring. If we do move forward with the detached units, I will like to explore that further. That's it for now on this specific one. Thanks.
Councilmember Rice.
Thank you very much, Madam President. So this is really interesting. It's interesting because I find myself personally in a time now where my mother is not happy with aging in place where she is in Kensington and is looking to downsize. And so we've considered whether or not she wants to come and live with us. And so this conversation around what's happening around this county is personal, because it's happening with my family right now. And it's an interesting one, because when I think about this particular question, so I want to get back to the specifics of this one, where it says, should detached be allowed in smaller lot zones? And I think to myself, so my mother, who's thinking about coming, would bring a car. So I do understand that part, and she's one person. So I'm just still trying to understand, if my lot was 0.75 acres or 1.25 acres, what would be the difference? I mean, what does that really affect when you talk about, and so folks had talked about neighbors and, you know, relationships. I mean, my mother's a great woman, so I don't think anybody would have an issue with her. So, I mean, so from that perspective, I mean, it's not as if you have a neighbor issue. So I'm just trying to understand what would be the issue with having a .75 lot. And so quite frankly, what it says to me is, oh, well, you have to be more affluent to move your mother in and have an ADU for her than not.
Well,
And that's what I specifically draw out of this lot size, because everything else when it comes to requirements are the same. I mean, regardless of whether the size of the ADU is whatever it may be, it's whatever the lot can accommodate. And of course, with DPS, you know, there are those certain requirements. So I don't see a direct correlation between lot size and, you know, the ADU. I mean, because you just build a smaller ADU if it's a smaller footprint. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me that there's this limitation that's there from that perspective. I'm not talking about ADUs in general. I just want to talk about this specific point because I want us to be very careful about the messaging that we're sending.
Well, some people would hope you love your mother enough so that it's attached to your unit.
Well, my mother, no. I love my mother enough. My mother doesn't love me enough that she wants to be around me 24/7. Trust me.
As
Tell your mother she's welcome in my home anytime, please.
As recommended by the committee, it cures the issue. It doesn't have a minimum lot size, and it allows it in small lot zones.
Which is right. Which is why I just want to chime in because this was a decision point that they had brought up as number one. Go ahead. And so I just wanted to make sure.
The one item that you left out is, and has a maximum of 10% of the lot size, which is rather than making a specific number related to each lot size, which is something that some people have requested, and I had some sensitivity to that because there is a concern. A 1,200 square foot unit in a 6,000 square foot lot is rather large. And particularly in my district and in some of the older neighborhoods in the county with particularly high property values, there are plenty of 1,000, 1,100 square foot homes that were built in the 1950s and 1960s with the expansion of the federal government into Bethesda. And so the way that we addressed it as the committee was 10% of the total lot size. So a 6,000 square foot lot could only have a 600, exactly to your point that you've raised of it shrinks down, no more than 1,200 in any lot size, and no more than 50% of the principal structure. Jeff can explain. There was some question of what the intent of the committee. I think the committee has clarified that it's the footprint of
50% of the footprint
of the principal unit. So you have a house, a home, a principal structure that takes up 1,200 square feet of footprint, which is a large house. I mean, that could be usually as a 2,400 or 3,000 square foot house. You only could be half of that at maximum, so that would still be a 600 square foot unit. And so we have significantly restricted the size of the ADUs while still allowing them in the smaller lots, which are where they are most attractive to most workers, to most seniors, because they're most accessible with public transportation, with amenities of all the places that you want. So these are folks who aren't going to be living in isolation. The whole reason why you'd want your parent to live is for that purpose.
Which is why, again, I also want us to be very careful about our conversations and what we're saying, because it's very dangerous to start assuming that, well, everyone who comes in and we're going to have neighbor issues. Let's not assume that everybody wants to have an Airbnb and those kinds of things, because that's not the case. I mean, I'm just speaking from personal standpoint, but I know other people who have these structures, who have their parents living with them, and it's a big deal. So let's not characterize this as, and then make it seem as though this is going to upend neighborhoods. I'm not saying that there will not be an instance where you may not get along with your neighbors, but guess what, folks? That happens now. That happens now. That's not something that doesn't happen now. I'm not talking about the Airbnb piece, and I think that, again, we'll address that issue when we get to it. That's a whole nother issue that we need to talk about. I'm talking about the simple fact of people getting along with people. And there are some of those instances where people don't get along, but there are plenty of them where they do. And so I think that it's incredibly important for us, when we look at issue number one, to make sure that we're not pitting affluent versus non-affluent and solely relying upon lot size and saying that smaller lot zones are something that is restricted, whereas large lot zones are not, is incredibly problematic and is bad government business.
Thank you. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, members of the Fed Committee, for the diligent work over 3 work sessions, I believe, and for the conversation that will ensue here over how many ever work sessions is needed to get this right. And while I have lots of questions about this, I'm going to subscribe to the format that the Fed Committee Chair has asked, so I'm going to stick to this one particular item right now. And I'm going to pick up on Councilmember Albernaz's question regarding sediment. And so and I don't know who to address this to, whether it's permitting or anybody else, but walk through once again when a sediment control permit is required. And then my more pointed question is, if there is runoff created from a detached ADU and it goes into a neighbor's property, what's the recourse for that neighbor?
Just to answer your second part of your question, there are issues right now in the county about runoff that people complain to us or DHCA. And the way we are treating it, it's a civil matter. So I mean, as far as DPS is concerned, I don't know if DHCA treats it differently. And to answer your first part, I don't know if you want to go. And the answer to your part, so like any structure, any type of building permit, if you come to DPS right now, again, I think it's on page 18, under item D, that kind of tells you what requires a sediment control permit. And we would look at something like this as a minor land disturbance. So if it's, again, less than 5,000 square feet, it would not require a sediment control permit. To look at all this stuff, we would look at something for a new home. If a new home would come, it has to go through the whole review for a sediment control, which I explained, would be looking at the drainage, to contain the water on site with dry wells and stuff like that. For an accessory structure, this is what we do today. It's nothing would be changed. It would be looking at that thing as we would look at any other structure. It's not disturbing more than 5,000 square foot. It would be a minor land disturbance.
And just in terms of organization, sediment control is not a zoning issue and would have to be required by a separate bill.
So it would have, if further action was required, or
if the council desired changes, it would have to be a separate bill.
Duly noted. And so getting back to the point about it being a civil matter, so that's a lawsuit.
Just to make one correction, is if it's over 400 square foot, we would review it for the roof drainage to make sure that water is contained. But other than that, it would not have a sediment control permit to look at everything else. I just want to be clear about that.
Okay. Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you.
Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much. I'd like to get back to the whole idea of the 50% of the existing home. So if in R60, and that's 6,000 square feet, right, per lot. All right, so that would be a lot that's 40 by 150, whatever that would be, the usual. I mean, they're usually not that deep, that deep. So the home that could be there now with all the setbacks and everything else, do we know a size of a home that could actually be on an R60 lot?
Well, we do know that there's a 35% maximum lot coverage, and that would still apply even if you did in accessory units. I have to say that the 1,200 square foot limit actually came from the half of the average house size in 1974. So it did make some sense.
In R60 or all the zones?
In all the zones. That was the average single-family house being built in 1974. I think since then it's increased, not decreased at all. for
And
that
I
hatch
think,
zone.
but I think it's significant that you're saying of the footprint of the house.
As the individual council members are on the committee are saying.
Or it's someone saying,
Yes.
I don't know that I'm blaming you, Jeff, I'm just mentioning.
And you have to remember these tie together. It was the lowest of any of those measures. It was the lowest of 50% of the footprint of the house, or 10% of the lot, or 1,200 square feet. So it was the lowest of those three numbers. It would never be more than 1,200, no matter how big the house, no matter how big the lot.
And the 1,200, let's say someone's going to try to build it to the 1,200, that has to be the entire size of the house. It's not just the footprint of the house, right? So it would be if somebody decides that they are going to build a two-story house or detached
You
house.
mean ADU?
ADU, yeah.
Yeah, the ADU maximum is 1,200. There is 1,200 square feet. There is one exception for that, and that's if your basement is bigger than 1,200 square feet, and of course, the ADU is in your basement. Then the committee's recommendation is allow it as large as the footprint of your house.
All right, and let's say that someone that's attached, not detached, but attached, right now has, in that 6,000, my 6,000 square foot lot here. If they decided to build an addition to their home, not saying somebody else is going to come in there and live, but if you build an addition to your home, you can have somebody else come in there and live. But if they were doing that now, they would be under similar requirements, right?
They would have a maximum coverage limit of 35%.
Even as it exists this moment?
Yes.
Yeah. So that doesn't change, is what you're saying.
And wouldn't change under what's proposed by the committee or the bill, or the ZTA.
But if someone, as an example, wanted to have the attached unit or build the basement out, they would have to have all the safety features. They would have to have an egress for somebody to come and go, not just window. There has to be all the safety features, correct?
It depends what they were building it for. Again, are they building it for the ADU? Certainly,
Even if they're not building it for an ADU, if they're building it so that one of their children could live in the basement, they can't live in the basement unless there's direct access to the outside.
You need direct access.
Okay. And I guess the other question is, and I think the whole idea for the footprint really does limit. I know the other one is the side yard requirements. Is there a change on the side yard requirements or the front foot requirements from an ADU to an existing home?
None.
So you still have to meet those as well.
Well, an accessory structure has its own side lot limits, which are not changed by this ZTA.
But if you're in a zone that says you have to have a 10-foot side yard, you still have to have a 10-foot side yard, regardless of whether it's an ADU or whether you're just adding a room or a rec room.
Right.
Yeah.
Or you're doing a garage.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Riemann.
Thank you. Just to refresh where we are, we're really
Page 6,
handling the first four in a sense at the same time, which is fine. This is the biggest piece of it. There's one or two other big ones, but this is, should they be allowed in smaller lot zones? We've had a lot of conversation about that. Should there be a minimum lot size? As Councilmember Rice observed, the current code is you have to have an acre. This is proposing to delete that and allow it, but there should be size limits. The Fed Committee's recommendation is that there is a 3-part test for your limit. And so
For detached limit.
For your detached limit, thank you, not your interior unit limit. Your interior unit limit is either 1,200 feet or the footprint of your basement. Now, we have heard from some who said, what if I wanted to use the whole first floor of my house? And that was bigger than 1,200 feet. That's an issue, but we're not going to get into that right now. So we're talking about, should the size be limited? The Fed Committee's recommendation is to limit the size of the units as described. Interior is 1,200 feet max, unless it's your basement, whatever size your basement is. I've heard from residents who have very large basements. They would like to convert them. They otherwise would be mandated to block off and make unusable a share of their basement, which just makes no sense. And so the proposal that the Fed committee recommends to the full council is a test that says your detached unit can only be 10% of your lot size. Councilmember Friedson described it, and he was the author of that idea. And I think it's a very elegant solution to this question, because it recognizes that in smaller lot zones, a smaller ADU is more appropriate. It is not what the initial draft had recommended. As far as height limits, we did not recommend any change to height limits. Item number 3, we said whatever there is an existing code for accessory structures. If you want to build a garage on your property, you are allowed to do that if you can meet the conditions of an accessory structure in the code. And so we are not changing those. We're saying you can build to the allowance for an accessory structure. And as Councilmember Friedson said, part of our rationale is why should we have a more restrictive policy for building housing for people than we do for building garages for cars or guest houses for those of us who are wealthy enough to be able to afford to build a guest house. You can do that as an accessory structure today.
The one limitation you did put in, if you're using an existing structure, you cannot expand it up or out. So these height limits do not apply to the existing structure. And if you did if you did the Fonzie room, I love that term, you would have to meet the setback requirements as a new structure.
That's right. So if you want to make if you have a detached garage, which I think you see those. When I look around my neighborhood, I see detached garages on some properties. Some of them have already been converted, actually, to studios, work studios. And I just want to say, I've been thinking about this for a long time. At one point, I realized that almost every house I can see from my property has either a family member, like an adult child living in there, an adult child with a child living there, not in an accessory dwelling unit, but just in the house, in the basement or in the house, or a detached accessory structure. And guess what? My neighborhood's a great place to live. It is a great place to live. Having accessory structures does not make your neighborhood less than a great place to live. In any event, we said that if you wanted to convert one of those existing structures, if you wanted to raise the height, then you would have to meet the code, which is going to not allow you to add a second story that is too close to the lot line. You're going to have to step it away from the lot line. You can't add a window overlooking the neighbor's property. There are some particular issues there. So again, I think at this point we're in items number 1 through 4.
All right, Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you for that. Thanks for allowing me to step in and clarify a couple things that the committee did. I appreciate it and apologize for going a bit out of turn there. One is I want to appreciate Rose Hacking on my staff, who has really helped me deal with all of the questions, the positive and negative feedback, and the clarifications that we've gotten from residents. I know the county executive had mentioned some feedback that he got. We've gotten a lot more than what he has mentioned. I think we've gotten almost 500 emails from folks. It doesn't include phone calls. It doesn't include the 3 dozen resident association, neighborhood association meetings we've gone to and gotten feedback, the community town halls that this has been discussed at every one, and the Friday coffees, Fridays with Friesens that we've been doing. So we've gotten quite a bit of feedback on this. I will say, and I think it's important to note, we've received more positive feedback than negative. And I know that that is not, may not be how it appears, but it is true. But I have taken considerable effort. I think the committee did considerable work to take each and every one of the criticisms and concerns of the initial legislation and try to focus on every area of that. I think that these first 4 items speak to that, where we have come up with what I think are thoughtful compromises. Doesn't mean that there couldn't be some additional tweaks here at full council. I think that there is room for that, but I think to suggest that we haven't been undergoing a thoughtful and deliberative process is just not reasonable and not fair. To say that you want it a little slower, to say that you don't want it at all, that's totally reasonable. I'm fine with differences of opinion, but it's not a legitimate viewpoint to say that we have not taken considerable time to weigh these issues and gone into considerable amount of work. I think we had 4 Fed committee sessions where this was discussed. We're now having at least 2, because we already have the next one scheduled here at full council over the course of months. This is 1901. The first bill introduced. It makes it easy because we get the number right there. It's the first. Bill, and I will also want to thank Rose as well, not just for weeding through all of the different items of this and helping me navigate what is a very complicated issue in our zoning code, a very serious issue in our zoning code. But she also brought me an Encyclopedia Britannica to figure out who the Fonz was. So I appreciate that. First, she had to find the Encyclopedia Britannica. She went over to Katz's office, picked one up. He's got them every year. Every year in every volume since the first budget that he worked on, and I won't tell you what year that was. But just a few items. I think we've spoken to this, and I think the council president spoke well to this as well. There was a letter, and I think she spoke to it without specifically mentioning it, but there was a letter in the Washington Post that I just think it's important. I'm embarrassed. Yep. I'm not going to repeat what it said. I'm not going to state the words that it used, but I will tell you that as a resident of Montgomery County, whether you agree with this or disagree with this, it was disgusting and embarrassing. I am particularly embarrassed that the county executive recommended this person, and we not having the benefit of reading this disappointing and letter that is so far removed from the way that we view our neighborhoods and our neighbors and the people who we want to live with, and the way that we expect to talk about people and treat people. And so I just think it goes with saying specifically that I believe I speak for all of my colleagues, and certainly all of the work that we have always done reflects that I speak for all of my colleagues to say that it's repudiated and denounced formally here from this dais, and I don't think that there should be anybody anywhere in county government, and frankly, I'd prefer to have nobody in our community at all who uses that type of terminology, who talks about these issues in those types of ways. It's fine to disagree. It's fine to have reasonable points of discussion, but to speak to it that way is beyond the pale and is not reflective of the type of community that we want to live in. With that said, I want to speak to the scope here, because we talked about this quite a bit in committee. I think it's important for colleagues to understand, and for the public who might not have been following. We have 468 at last count that was presented to the committee, I believe, of ADUs, registered ADUs and RLUs, residential living units, which are non-rented versions of the same type of structure in the county. It's a very small number. We know that there are a good number of them that aren't licensed. We'd like to make this a little bit easier so that we get as many, if not all, licensed, so that they can actually be safe and habitable, and hopefully with the work that the council did, inspected on a regular basis, and the type of living facilities that we all expect to have in a place like Montgomery County. But there's a lot of talk about other places that are doing this and whether or not we're just trying to mimic other places. Portland, for instance, with their much more relaxed ADU bill, a fraction of 1% of their total housing stock has an ADU on it. One fraction of 1%. So if this increases the number of ADUs by 10 times or 15 times, which I think is probably more than is likely anytime soon, but I think certainly for the proponents would be a great outcome for those who really do want to see this. We're talking about a very minuscule number proportionally of our total housing stock. So the idea that every house on every block is going to do this, I think is far-fetched, and I think it is not reflective of the policy that we're actually talking about and the impact that policy, which I actually have, which are legitimate to discuss, and I think we should discuss, and I believe we have discussed. The last piece, just piggybacking off of Councilmember Rice, to these 4 points in terms of how we view this, the way that the committee discussed this was it shouldn't be dramatically easier, not just the garage versus living space, as the chairman mentioned, and as I have previously talked about. But it's the question of how easy is it to knock down a house or to put a significant addition on a house, and how easy is it to build an ADU on a house for your mother or for a loved one, or just to allow you, like Gabe's grandparents were able to do, to monetize the only or the largest asset that you have to be able to keep up with a place that's increasing in cost. And Montgomery County certainly is doing that. All of the questions that Councilmember Glass mentioned, which are very important and legitimate, and many of those that Councilmember Albornoz mentioned, it is no easier to build an ADU. In fact, it is harder to build an ADU. We have more restrictions on ADUs, even after, if we pass the bill as was proposed by the committee, than to knock down a house and build a new one, than to put a significant addition on a new one. And so when we think about public policy, when we think about how we're addressing this, we shouldn't make it far easier for wealthy residents than we do for middle-income residents. I'm not saying we should attack wealthy residents and say nasty things about them, but we shouldn't make it, as a matter of public policy and a matter of who we are as a community, significantly easier for somebody to buy a property and knock it down. To the point of how many in a neighborhood or what the integrity of the neighborhood is, we have none of those such restrictions of what is one sediment impact or one amount of dirt impact or one improvement impact going to have on one property by calculating what the neighboring properties have done. There are plenty of neighborhoods in my district, in the older neighborhoods, of houses that were built in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s that have knockdown after knockdown after knockdown as people move out and new people move in for a variety of reasons. I'm not knocking that and saying that that's terrible. Some people like it. Some people hate it. People think it's a demonstration of revitalization of the neighborhood. Some people think that it completely changes the character of it. But we don't control that. We have specific setback requirements, height requirements, and lot coverage requirements. And other than that, it's a property owner issue. And I think it's important, as we discuss these issues, as well as staff discusses them, of what our limitations are in terms of property taking and in terms of what we can impose upon a property owner who owns the land, has paid for that land, and has the ability, within reasonable and legitimate guidelines, to build on that land and provide housing for themselves and for others. And so I just think it's important, as we discuss this, that we think about it in that framework. I think that was the framework in which the committee did its deliberation. As I stated from the beginning, I think it's important to understand what the real scope is here and to make sure that we don't get caught up on both sides, that this is going to be a panacea that solves all of our affordable housing problems, which it absolutely will not. It's one small tool in the toolkit. It is going to not, and for the others who say it's going to affect every single, every single unit in every single neighborhood in every single part of the county, that's just fundamentally untrue. And so we've got to talk about this for what it is and what we're talking about and how we're doing it and have a reasonable discussion. I look forward to continuing that.
Thank you. Councilman Albornoz.
Great comments, Councilmember Friedson, and in the spirit of that productive conversation, I just had a couple other questions now that we're adding the other 3 points regarding size. So when we calculate the size of the living area, does that or does that not include a garage? And where I'm going with this is that if somebody does have a detached garage and then wants to build an ADU, a detached ADU in addition to that, but not have it be part of the garage, is the square footage that is the garage added in the calculation, or is it separate?
It's separate. It's not living area.
Great.
And even if it were switched to an ADU, that's a change of use in DPS's terms and requires a different set of circumstances.
And just to be clear, you can't have two ADUs. So if they chose the garage as the ADU, they couldn't add another ADU. And where the place where the garage would come into play is with that maximum lot coverage. That's still included there. So while it's not part of your calculation for your living space, it is definitely part of the calculation for how much coverage of impervious surface you can have on your property.
So they couldn't add the third.
They could add the
component.
third accessory structure as long as the existing structures plus it didn't go above 35% of their lot area.
Okay. And then with regards to the height, I know that there have been restrictions placed on the height, but under those current restrictions, could you still build a second floor on an ADU depending on, look, so for 1,200 square feet, you probably could build a second floor.
The maximum height is 20 feet. I guess it's physically possible to have two levels in 20 feet.
Okay. It's hard. The second floor does concern me a little bit because, to Councilmember Friedson's point earlier, 1,200 square feet, even if by definition you've got the size to do it, that is a fairly large second piece of property on someone's home, and particularly if it has a second floor, then that could be a potential intrusion just from a privacy standpoint. So that is something that I'm going to look at exploring a little bit further, just the cap. I think the three provisions that connect it to the size and scope of the lots are good. I just have a hard time with the 1,200 as a cap, which feels kind of large to me, even for properties that are in a better position to adjust or accommodate the ADU.
The one thing I'll add is that there are added setbacks if you're above 15 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're higher, you have to be further away.
Sorry about that.
Are we on? Now I have to remember my own page.
We're doing 1 through 4 essentially now.
Right. So are we on 5 yet? No. Okay.
Okay, that's it for now on size. Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Jawanda.
Thank you, Council President, and thank you to all my colleagues for the robust discussion, and particularly to Councilmember Reamer and Friedson. We did have, somehow I lost the session. I thought it was 3, but it was 4. I knew we had many discussions about this, and I do think we ended up in a good place. Couple things. I'm glad, Jeff, you mentioned, and I want to thank the staff. I know you all worked hard on this as well as the administration staff. The importance of that setback requirement, that if you did go up higher, if you did have a lot big enough to go 1,200, again, you have the minimum 10% lot size, so you're going to have to be a large lot to be able to go up to 1,200 square feet. That additional setback further away from anyone's property could you just explain that? I think it's important.
Again, it's for height, you have additional setbacks.
Right.
Actually, there's 2. If you go higher than 15 feet, is it 2 for 1? I think it's 2 foot for every 1 foot you go back. The other requirement that we'll get into later, currently, if you're above 24 foot long, you need an additional setback.
Right.
The committee recommended 32 feet, and I'm sure we'll talk about that when we get to it.
Right.
But those are the setback requirements.
I appreciate it. And I just think it's important to note that, because that 2 for 1, a lot of people don't understand that, one, you have to have a big lot size in general to have that big of a unit, but that the higher you go, the further back you have to go. And just backing up a couple, since this is my first time addressing and we're in the 1 through 4, I think a lot of the angst, I live in the eastern part of the county, and a lot of the angst around ADUs, I think, comes from, in my part of the county in particular, comes from very well-founded concerns about residential compliance with code enforcement. And, because again, and it's important to note, hasn't really been talked about a lot today, that you can rent out rooms in your house now with you don't have to go through any process. And so when you have in neighborhoods where you have people, because of affordability or living with many people in homes, and they might not be breaking code, because another thing, we had a whole conversation with DPS about the square footage that's required to actually be habitable, and many people, what neighbors might think is habitable is a larger number than is actually required. But I think we've acknowledged in the Fed committee and in the council that part of the reason we have in this year's budget put more into code enforcement is so that you can step up and do some of that residential code enforcement. And I think these two issues, unfortunately, have been conflated to the point where people are thinking about that but talking about ADUs. And I think it's important to note, one of the main appeals for me with the ADU conversation, I think for the vast majority of people, where you're going to have the deepest affordability, are going to be the attached units, where I think most of the units are going to be basements that previously didn't have their own kitchen in them, that now can become full ADUs. Someone's already living there, and that's where I think, particularly where I live, where you're going to find the most affordability for people. Again, it's important to remember building an ADU is an onerous process, and it's going to cost significant amount of money depending on where you are. And so the idea that there's going to be this, to quote this letter to the editor, which I agree with Councilmember Friedson, is completely out of bounds. This proliferation was the word used in there, of all these units, I don't think is going to happen. And I think the affordability is really going to happen in the attached units. Now, does that mean that some people who have the means and the interest are going to want to build detached units, either to house their senior parents or a family member with disabilities, or whatever of course they will, but it's not going to be this large number of people. Again, you have a lot of requirements, a lot of money to do it, and I think we struck a good balance here as far as the cost, as far as the code enforcement that we've done, and with limiting the size with the increased setbacks. So I just want to say that because I think the public that's just listening to this debate, a lot of people have concern about residential code enforcement, and we hear that. And that's why we've added money to step that up. But ADUs are actually not going to exacerbate that. If anything, it'll encourage some people to come into the regulatory regime, we hope, and become more compliant. So I just think it's important to bring that up. And while I'm certainly understand my colleagues' concerns on some of the issues, and I think we can do some tweaks, I just wanted you to hear that piece of it because I really think that's a big part of this debate. So thank you.
If I may just say something, part of an attached accessory units is the definition that is part of a detached house, so it could not be in a townhouse.
Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Madam President. So coming back to this size and height issue, in part of this conversation, which is for me not being a member of the Fed committee, as educational as it is for members of the community who are tuning into this robust discussion now, explain to me the height determination, particularly within the different zones. It seems to me that it's been a while since I've had to compute the Pythagorean theorem, but there are various computations which it would be great to have visuals of some of this regarding 2 for 1, this, that. So help walk me and everyone else through this.
I can be corrected on this by DPS, but I think it's the mean grade of the unit to the midpoint of a pitched roof is generally how you get.
That's the best English yeah, okay. I mean, but this is the heart of the discussion, that it's not so simple to understand.
There's certainly a low point of that grade, and there are different points along that it has a different height. Here we go. I did pretty well. Building height is measured from the average grade either to the mean height level between the eaves and ridge of a gable, hip, mansard, or a gabled roof to the highest point of the roof, regardless of the roof type.
There is a visual in the zoning code. It does, it is slightly helpful, even though it's hard to follow the words. It gives you it shows you for a pitched roof and for a flat roof what that means.
Is that in our packet?
No.
Not in the packet, but it is in the code. We can get it for you.
We'll have it in the next packet.
So what I'm seeing from across the dais here, and my eyes are fine up for now, but so there are 2 houses there, or 2 structures. What would be helpful for me moving forward is more than 2. Having it in our packet or sharing it with us so that I can help understand exactly what we're talking about here. Because again, the mathematics here and the pitched this, midpoint that, it doesn't help. And I want to make sure this conversation results in the best legislation possible and is as educational as it can be for the general public. And so there are some missing components, and that would be one of them. And then secondly, regarding the 10% and height and again, the calculations that would go into any structure. If we're in an R60 and if we're in an R60 and so the square footage would be 600 square feet.
Yeah, because
Correct.
it's 10%.
Correct. Is it possible to do 2 floors with 1,200 square feet?
No.
So it's total square footage.
Yeah, that's the total square footage of the ADU. It has to be 600 square feet.
Right, okay.
It would not make sense to do that as 2 stories, but.
I'm asking questions
right,
that
you
I'm
could.
unsure about, that I know plenty of other people are unsure about.
If you had a 300-foot footprint for that ADU, you could do it as 2 stories.
So again, comes back to math, and I already admitted I'm not that good at it. So that was the better equation. Thank you, teacher. So a 300 square foot footprint could, if other calculations work out, could be 2 stories of 300 and 300.
Right, with the proper setback, because it would be.
Oh,
required setback.
and so Pythagoras is on the dais somewhere, so thank you. Oh, Chair of the Education and Culture Committee, I do appreciate it. You've been assigned well, so that's good. A squared, B squared, C squared, yeah, this is great. Should I add this to the record? What we're missing is the lot size and all of that, but yes, Pythagorean theorem, you get an A+, Chair Rice. So if we could visualize this in some other ways, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that takes us through the first 4 issues, and let's continue through the packet. Item number 5. This is the question of the distance requirement. So this is, Jeff, did you want to, before you begin on item number 5, is there anything you needed to say about one? Okay. So this is the requirement in the code that the council put in when we adopted the current ordinance many years ago, which, by the way, was in 2013, is that right?
2013 is when.
2013 is when we did a meaningful, significant revision of the code.
That's
we did a
correct.
minor tweak to it last fall, but it has been 6 years. And we know precisely what the consequence of the council's previous legislating on this was, which was very few ADUs being created. And last time we took it up, we embraced a number of restrictions that have had the effect of restricting ADUs. And one of them was this distance requirement, which says you can't build an ADU if there is another one nearer than 300 feet to you.
Right, which is about on your block, if you will.
Pretty much a block, both sides of the block too, by the way.
Right, be confronting as well.
Right.
I mean, it was a way to limit concentration.
I think it was
of
a
ADUs.
parking, it was out of concern over parking and concentration. That's probably the better word is, oh, well, we ought to try to limit this. So we're going to say 1 per both sides of the block, more or less.
And one of the things that the council should recognize is that under other laws the council has passed, it is possible for an opponent of an ADU to request to have an objection to it, and for the purposes of parking, go to the hearing examiner and have that objection looked into. And that is possible even if you meet parking codes.
Right.
It's a very quick process. The hearing examiner has just done the first 2 of them based on the changes in legislation from January. It's taken them about 3 weeks.
Right.
As opposed to 3 or 4 months. So this is an individual look at the objection. So that should somewhat help those who have problems with either this provision, which is the concentration issue, or the parking issue that we'll get in a little bit.
So can't talk about this without observing. If you want to do a knockdown on the house that you own and put up a McMansion, or a very large house, I should say, I don't mean to speak about it in a negative way, you can do it if there was already one on your block, or 2 or 5 or 10 on your block. You can do that. We don't say only one really expensive house is allowed on a block, but we do say only one ADU is allowed on a block. And I think that's an inequity that we need to correct. So to discuss this question of should the distance requirement be deleted, the committee recommends that we not have a distance restriction, that we tackle the issues through other means. Since really this is about the concentration issue, I think we're going to get into parking next, so we can talk about parking. I mean, people bring it up now, but one of the concerns of concentration is school impacts. What about school impacts? And we've heard from a lot of residents about how they would imagine this being utilized, and they predict that it will overwhelm the schools, and the schools are crowded, and this will result in more students. And in order to get to the bottom of that question, the planning department decided to actually look at the numbers. And Lisa Gavoni, who maybe here she is, did a fantastic job. Lisa, could you maybe share what you found, please?
Sure. For the record, Lisa Gavoni, Planning Department. One of the things that we did is we combined licensed accessory dwelling units and student enrollment for the 2018 year. And what we found is that the student generation for accessory dwelling units, and the way that we could only look at it is if it could be the principal dwelling or the accessory dwelling, because they have the same address. But the student generation rate was no different for our single-family detached unit as it is for dwelling units with an accessory dwelling unit.
Okay, so what that means is you looked at the average number of students
Yes.
in all single-unit properties,
Yes.
and you calculated the average, which is 0.45, 0.46?
0.462.
0.462. So that means for every single-unit property on average was 0.462 students.
Yes.
And then you looked at the combination of at properties with an ADU, so you're looking at both the house and the ADU together.
Yes.
And the number of students there was
0.464.
0.464. So there's an ear of a difference.
Yes.
That's about it. So there really is no difference, which I think is profoundly important, because to me it expresses that it demonstrates that the units are being used just how we think that they will likely be used. It's a very targeted, tailored solution, and you don't have multiple families living on the property. And the reason why you don't have multiple families living on the property, in my view, is because of the owner occupancy requirement. This is not the same thing as accusations that you hear of a house, multiple families renting inside of a house. We hear that accusation. But this is an owner occupancy requirement, so the homeowner has to live there. And if the homeowner has kids, anyone with kids knows that it's all you can do to handle your own kids. You're not going to invite another family to live on your property because you're just trying to stay above water with your own kids. And so it's just, this is an exaggerated demon in the minds of people that, the evidence doesn't bear out. And this was not a survey. There's no margin of error here. This is a census. You looked at the actual properties and the actual students at those properties. You got the MCPS enrollment data. And so, I think it says a lot about the concern about concentration. The concern about concentration was there's going to be a big impact from these. If there was a big impact from these, one of the things you would see would be higher school enrollment, because there were maybe more families living there. But we don't see that. Okay, dialogue.
Councilmember Albornoz.
A couple points. To Councilmember Glass's point, I'm also mathematically challenged. And so I do think that as part of our testimony, we did receive a diagram from a constituent that showed more or less what these would actually look like within a property. And so if the planning board does have any schematics, or if there's some visual that can talk, and this deals more with the first four questions, I apologize, going back to that a little bit, but just where exactly the setback is, and give some examples, visuals of what this would look like on properties, which would be helpful for me, but I think also for our residents as well, who understandably have some concerns regarding this. If the visual may help in dissuade some of those concerns, but also help us as we're deliberating over size and scope and the setback versus the not setback. So that would be helpful.
You might look to circle 37, 39, and 41 that give you how this would look on various zones with those setbacks, but we did not do the increased setbacks due to height or any other reasons. These are just meeting the setbacks and having the building areas for the various zones.
Height would be helpful. That would be great.
Well,
We can,
Park and Planning can do it.
we
I
can do
can't.
that. We'll have it for the next session.
Great, thank you. And with regards to concentration, I generally do agree that the economics of this are going to prevent too many people from moving forward, because it's going to be expensive to build and to be able to recuperate if you are planning on using it as a rental property in some way. You're going to have to charge a fair amount to be able to recuperate the cost of the development of these. I think the concentration for me is more of a parking issue, and I know we're addressing that in the next question, so I'll defer my comments prior to us framing the parking issue, which I would appreciate, because I know you guys had a lot of robust conversation regarding, and I know that's understandably a concern currently within communities, particularly for those with narrower streets or a number of homes that don't have driveways, which exists very much so in Kensington. And the Kensington Parkwood region has already a parking issue as it currently stands. Thanks.
Thank you.
Councilmember Jawanda.
Thank you. I'll be very quick on this. I do, I think this was something that we needed to do to remove the requirement that first come, first served basis, because again, as I stated in my comments a few minutes ago, I don't think you're going to see massive applications for this, and history in other places bears that out. But also, you want to be fair to, if someone has a change in circumstance, they want to bring us a parent in, they have a child with a disability, they should, just because their neighbor has one, they shouldn't not be able to apply. The other thing that Councilmember Friedson had a great point, which I think is important in committee, that we're going to have a separate bill that does several things that can't be done in a ZTA that address some of these other concerns. But one of the suggestions in this arena was to have a study that would look at this concentration issue every couple of years to see if we're seeing a problem or something we need to adjust. And I think that's a good idea. So I would just say that I think we should do that as we're going to do these other companion legislation to go on with some of these issues.
Vice President Katz.
Thank you. And was the concentration clause in there for attached as well as detached?
Yes.
It was. So somebody that had an attached home, they could, to I guess it was Hans's point earlier, that you could build a larger home, but you couldn't call it an ADU. How did that work?
If you had it as an ADU, you can only have one per 300 or 500 feet, depending. But if you just enlarge your home, there's no limit to how many enlarged homes you could have on a block.
So
if you had the tear downs, you could have as many tear downs on a block without examination other than the posting of a building permit. At least here, there is an appeal process here to some extent.
All right, so if someone said, I'm going to enlarge my home, and they go in for permitting and say, just enlarging my home, and ultimately they did have somebody else move in, or somebody's mother or whatever, that would still be allowed that way. But if they told that it was an ADU, that's when it became that you couldn't have your neighbor have one?
Right, it's really when it became an independent living unit. that it became the issue. And you know, the ADU can have 2 adults, and the other part of the house could have a full household. So it's that 2 household thing that also triggered the difference in treatment.
But if you built it originally for whatever purpose, and then said, you know what, we're gonna move in Mama, then at that point you didn't have to call permitting.
And you still don't.
Right. So, and then to the whole point of talking about the 300 square feet and the 6, you know, a parking space in Gaithersburg, but in other places it's slightly smaller, is 20 by 10, which is 300 square, which is 20 by 10, which is 200 square feet. So when you stop and think about the size of a footprint, if somebody was going to do a 300 square foot footprint, it's pretty small. I mean, that's a parking space, 1.5 parking spaces, not even counting the drive aisle. That's just the space itself. So somebody wouldn't, I mean, you couldn't really build a 2-story building with 300 square feet on each floor. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's awfully tiny. So, thanks.
Councilor Melburnose.
I'll note my first condo was 425 square feet. So, and my wife and I lived there for the first 2 years of our marriage, which was actually conducive to a new marriage because we couldn't hide. You know, it was good for communication. That's right. So I want to elaborate on Councilmember Joando's point because I think that is a reasonable compromise. We're anticipating that there won't be very many of these or a high concentration because of the economics. But there could be in some neighborhoods that are especially desirable where the economics make sense more than others for more of these to be built. And so I do think some reasonable assessment and an evaluation over a certain period of time in the event that actually that does in fact happen to provide some recourse or there to be a more extensive evaluation is I think a good approach. And so I would very much support, and I think that was actually one of the county executive's recommendations was that there be an evaluation over some period of time, which I think would be helpful.
Okay, Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Just to add on that, I appreciate Councilmember Jawando. This was a topic of discussion during the committee, and you know the difference I would say between the county executive's recommendation and the committee's is that we think we should move forward with what we believe is a thoughtful approach to try to relax the standards, to try to encourage and allow these to be a more realistic option for families in large portions of the county where I think they're actually needed and desired the most, recognizing that it's not the solution to everything and it's not going to create the problem everywhere that it's been discussed on both sides. I think the county executive's view is to not do anything and evaluate for a long period of time. And so I think that's the main area. But the idea of evaluating and having data to back it up, like the school generation data, which I think is important, I think will allow us to tweak it if we need to moving forward and to be able to make sure that we are keeping up with the regulatory side of this, which I think is going to be the most important to make sure that we're providing the right type of inspections like we've started to do in this year's budget. We can always add to that in future budgets. I think that was the way that we address it. In terms of the question of the numbers and the concentration, there's a couple aspects of this. One, we keep coming back to this because I think it's the theme of what the goal was of getting to the compromise that we got to and where we are at this point is we don't hold that standard of what another property owner is doing impacting what you're able to do on your property in any other context, and to hold that standard here where your private property rights are determined by what your neighbor does within a certain feet or a certain percentage is to me a bridge too far. It just doesn't make sense, particularly when we're talking about the middle income senior living and affordable housing for workforce housing and the other things that we're talking to create that new standard, which is unique in the zoning code. It's the only aspect of that we have, where we say you are infringed upon by what your neighbor does in a residential setting. I can't build a knockdown because my neighbor built a knockdown, and there are real impacts of that. The number of people who could live there because of the size of the structure and the number of the bedrooms, the number of cars that could potentially be there, the number of children who might be there. We don't create that context in any other scenario but this one, and I think that it's not appropriate to create that scenario. And the one point that I mentioned during the committee that I thought I'd bring up again here is my view is somebody who has an ADU is probably okay with the idea of having an ADU next to them, confronting them, backing up either side yards or backyard to backyard. We have a lot of neighborhoods, particularly in my community on small lots, where two backyards back up to each other, separated by sometimes a fence, sometimes a couple trees, whatever the case may be. To me, if I have an ADU and I am renting it out to somebody, the idea that my neighbor in the backyard also has an ADU, to prevent that from even being a possibility, when I'm probably somebody who endorses the idea of an ADU by virtue of the fact that I have built one. And if I don't endorse the idea of an ADU, I don't think that I should have the right to tell my neighbor behind me or next to me that they can't have an ADU. And talking about pitting neighbors against neighbors to create a race for who can get to DPS first, to be the first person within 300 feet of another, I think is inappropriate, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I just thought that was important context and appreciate the comments.
Councilmember Rima.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll move on to the next item, which is parking requirements. So the committee made a recommendation that there will be no additional parking requirement for an ADU within a mile of a Metro or Purple Line station. And outside of a mile of a Purple Line or Metro station, then you have to build one spot or apply for a waiver if there's adequate street parking, you believe there's adequate street parking, and you don't want to build an additional parking spot on your property, you can apply for a waiver. I want to say, and Lisa once again did some excellent data research, and I'll ask her to present her findings. But this is one where I think we really have to be careful, because I have found that many residents do not, what they perceive as a negative impact is actually additional paving in front yards, additional stormwater runoff, additional change in the character of the front yard landscape of the block. And so an additional car on the block is of less consequence than an additional driveway on the block. And so I think views on this one are much more dispersed than it might initially seem. I think a lot of those down county communities within a mile, for example, where we're not requiring it, can be tight, and people might have a smaller front yard. You wouldn't want to make them pave over their front yard. But in the packet, you'll find the research that Lisa did on page 11. And I'm going to take a leap here and try to just define it, and then Lisa, I'll ask you to correct. So you looked at the vehicle registration database, and you compared that against the database of accessory dwelling units, and you found that there is a slight difference in the average number of vehicles. Right. And for properties within a mile, there is about a third more of a car on average, which basically means for every 3 ADUs, there's one more car. Right. And then for properties outside of a mile, it's 0.4. So for, slightly more than that, a little bit less than every 3 ADUs, there's one more car. So that is not what people have maybe in their minds. I think a lot of people might think that every ADU comes with a car. Guess what? On average, it does not. On average, it's only one car for every 3 ADUs difference. And so I think this speaks to why we want to be careful about requiring more parking spaces. Because when you have to build a parking space on your property, A, that's a lot of expense, and that gets to the affordability of creating the housing solution in the first place. And B, it's a lot more runoff to the curb, and to the stormwater system, and C, it's not as attractive. You know, you're paving over something that is more attractive than what you're putting in place. So I think this is an area where this waiver process that we've created, you know, can really also be a very helpful tool, where if you have adequate street parking, why would we want you to build a driveway, more, you know, an expanded driveway? Why would we want you to do that? So if you believe you have adequate street parking, you may apply for that waiver from the hearing examiner. And so outside of a mile, if you are required to build one more spot, but you may apply for a waiver if you believe you have adequate street parking. Inside of a mile, you do not have to build an additional spot. That is the committee's recommendation. Lisa, is there anything you would want to add on the research?
That was great. The one thing I want to emphasize is we only looked at the universe of R60, R90, and R200. So this is pretty much the only area that this could apply to. So when you look at like county-wide data, it would include the entire county for the census. That would include multifamily. We only looked at single unit detached in the R60, R90, and R200. So only the universe of the people that could have a detached ADU.
The only thing I'd add in terms of scope, again, there's 72,000 acres in R60, R90, R200. The reduced parking only applies to 12,000 acres of that. So it's a relatively small percentage in which you're getting the reduced parking.
Okay. All right, ready for discussion.
Councilmember Albornoz.
Thank you, Madam President. So going back to my personal example of my grandparents who had the ADU in their basement, which by and large the pros outweighed the cons, but there was a con, and that was cars. The neighborhood that they lived in had an extraordinarily narrow street, one of those streets where you have to stop and wait for another car to pass you because two cars with parked cars couldn't both fit. And there was instances in which my grandparents' neighbors would complain when their tenant, in some cases, would have a friend or two over, and so there may be, you know, more than just her car or his car parked on the street. And there was one incident I remember specifically in which the neighbor hit one of the cars of her tenant because they were not able to adequately come out. And so I know that this was a source of discussion, and I do support the current code that is the half mile. And I believe my colleague, Councilmember Friedson, supported this notion. And I went back and looked, and her unit was actually 0.75 miles from the metro. And so I'm not sure, and I don't have enough depth or context to know how many streets are like my grandparents' old streets, but there are enough of them I know that this could be an issue where you do have, just for whatever reason, unusually smaller street angles and sizes. So I do support, in this case, going back to what's in the original code at half a mile.
And that's not in the original code. That was a first proposal by Andrew Friedson. If you're looking at geometry here, remember I said 12,000 acres are involved in the within a mile routine. If you did a half mile, it would be about 4,000 acres.
Yeah, I misspoke. I apologize. I meant that within the context of the conversation, I agreed with my colleague Friedson's position on this.
Councilmember Friedson.
Well, I always appreciate when my colleagues have the courage and conviction to agree with me. So I appreciate that. And I wish I had the full force of every proposal I make in committee just automatically being adopted into the zoning code. And I think that's what Councilmember Albornoz was alluding to. And so without objection from my colleague, no, okay. I still would prefer the superpower of being able to walk through flames and having no impact on me, although being able to make uniform changes to the zoning code without a second would be pretty terrific also, and could be kind of interesting and exciting at the same time. Just to clarify, and I think my proposal that I had put forward, and I think it's important to note the change from the original proposal to where we got, the What this does is allows all of the existing beyond 1 mile would retain the current code standards. So the current code standards of what the parking requirements would be, of how much parking you would have to require, that was discussed. That is what is in the existing code. What this is doing is not adopting what was originally introduced, which would have significantly relaxed the parking. This was a serious item of concern for a lot of residents that I think all of us heard from. That's why we moved where we did. I had proposed a half mile to Metro and Purple Line for the reason that that is the standard walk shed that is used. My colleagues on the committee felt strongly to expand it to 1 mile. I was willing to go along with that. And I, as I mentioned in committee, I live 0.6 miles from the Bethesda Metro, and I walk to the Bethesda Metro. And I, when I moved into that condo, I moved into it in the context that I was walkable to Metro, and that was something that was very important to me. And I paid a premium for the walkability to Metro. So the 0.5 miles to me personally, was not a magical number, but that is the standard number, at least from my impression and understanding, which is why I had recommended the half mile. But the point of this was to reach a compromise, which didn't do the things that Councilmember Reamer talked about, not only creating impervious services that we don't necessarily need to create, increasing the cost of housing that we don't necessarily want to, but in every other aspect of our public policy, we are trying to not assume that everybody's going to have a car. And in this case, we are literally assuming, regardless of how close you are to transit, that everybody has to have a car, and we are basically going to charge you for having that car, and we are incentivizing you because we're already baking in the cost of that driveway for the car. And I think from our environmental goals and for the way that we are moving forward in all of the decisions that we're making, that is not the way that we should be thinking about those issues. So that was the conversation that we had, and I just wanted to clarify that, and I appreciate the comments of Councilmember Reamer. My view is we absolutely should keep this provision, whether it stays at the mile, which I was comfortable with and moved from my original proposal, or we go back to my original proposal. I'd be open to either of those.
Council Vice President Katz.
Thank you very much. I think I'm for the half a mile because, first off, what happens if someone takes an existing parking space to build the ADU? If you have a driveway, and in order to meet the setbacks and everything else, you're going to need to take that area where the driveway is, or to the point of you're using an existing garage and you had a car parked in there, and now it's going to change to. So what happens to that situation?
You're required to have 2 parking spaces for that house.
So they would still have to come back and have a second. They would have to do a larger impervious area so that if they wanted to do it anyhow.
If they previously had 4 parking spaces and are required to have 2, they could build over part of their driveway. But they are required to have the minimum parking spaces for the single-family house.
So they would still have to have that requirement, but not anything the way it's written right now. Not anything if they're within the mile. Not anything within the additional.
Now, there are some houses within that mile that were not required to have any parking spaces when they were built.
Mm-hmm.
So of course they would not be covering over a driveway in your scenario, but those houses would still not be required to have any additional parking on their space.
And okay, and for the Lisa, for the idea for the registration for the existing ADUs, how many of those were detached and how many were attached?
Do you mean how many the houses were?
Yeah, I mean for the car registration.
I only looked at single-family detached houses.
Everything was detached.
Detached because that's the universe that the CTA applies to.
And the only other thing I would say is that, and I understand a townhome is a different, is a detached an attached home, but in the existing ADUs, there could be the scenario that somebody is living in those for childcare or for a parent or whatever, an older person. But In this case, there would be the possibility that you'd actually be, if it was a detached one, you'd actually be renting, and for an attached too, for that matter, but you'd be renting it out to another family. So I don't know whether that would change the scenario for how much parking you'd need. And you know, we wouldn't know until we do this. But my guess is you would have more parking requirements, because if it's a separate family, it's one thing if everybody's using the car or the van, but it's another thing if it's a separate family and living independent lives. So I think that's something that we should consider. But I think that if you're going to have any real, and to Councilmember Albernaz's point, if you're going to have any real excitement over your neighbor, it's the lack of parking. I mean, and that's what happens in many cases. I know that in the experiences I've had, people will say, you know, that my next door neighbor, it's an overcrowding situation, and you know, they'll talk about that, but they really will not complain until there's no parking left, and that's what happens, and you see that in various areas. So I'm in favor of the half a mile.
Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Madam President. So, since we've all been sharing stories, where we've lived, how we've lived, when first apartment in downtown Silver Spring was about a half a mile to the metro, moved there specifically because of that, and most of my neighbors walked. The first condo in South Silver Spring was 0.7 miles, and there is no parking in the building. It's on Eastern Avenue. So no parking in the building. If you have a car, you either park on the street or you purchase a monthly parking permit from one of the county facilities in the neighborhood. I walked most every day to the metro 0.7 miles, and most of my neighbors walked that 0.7 miles, and that was essentially why we had moved there. And so I understand the delicacy of this conversation, because clearly not every community in Montgomery County is downtown Silver Spring and South Silver Spring, nor do we want to turn every community into those areas. Understood. Regarding the data that is in the packet, the cars per household is only shared for the 1 mile radius. Do we have data for half a mile or even 3/4 of a mile?
I do not have that with me, but I can bring that back for you next week.
Another homework assignment, if you could bring that
Yes.
back, thank you. I would appreciate that. I'd like to see what that data look like. Another question regarding communities that currently have residential parking permits. How do ADUs and the new residents that would move into those communities, how do the residential parking permits factor into that equation?
Does not. It's a separate issue.
So let me conflate the issues then. If you're in a community where parking is already, where residents are concerned about the parking and they have parking permits through the county program, then we build ADUs, and they are residents of that community as well. Run from that scenario.
They would be able to get a parking permit just like any other resident. Most parking permit places are where there's a daytime part of the problem, where there's office workers invading a neighborhood is where there are parking programs. I do not know of a parking program where it's the nighttime issued problem. So that would be a whole separate thing if they wanted to do a parking permit situation. And I don't know that there are limits to the number of people who can get that permit. It's the number of cars in your family. You can get a parking permit for each one as long as you are a resident.
So thank you for that explanation. So a few thoughts here. The residential parking permits typically are in communities that are close to transit, where you want to discourage people from dropping their car off and then walking to one of the transit options.
Or going to the office.
Right, or go to the office. There are communities, particularly in DC and other areas, metropolitan, more urban type areas, where they have longer time limits. So I'm hearing that one possibility, depending on how this conversation goes, is maybe extending some of those programs into the evening or into a later point in time to help control some of the parking if that becomes a problem.
Right. The one department I don't have here is Department of Transportation.
There we go.
But
I don't want to add to a homework assignment, but duly noted that it is a DOT issue.
we'll come back and see if they have any response to it. But again, it would be unique for them to have a nighttime parking permit situation.
Yeah, if we're rethinking ADUs and having a sincere conversation about the parking, then rethinking some of those parking programs might be ripe for this discussion as well. And then last point I want to make is regarding some of the changing natures of transportation. And I understand and appreciate the comments that the Fed committee chair made about the half mile, and I'm understanding of the other thoughts regarding some of the other communities and the mile and the conversation that will continue here in the dais. But we in the county and nationally, when we talk about transportation, the terminology that we've been using of late is the last mile challenge and how we get people to transit in that last mile. And just this week, our own Department of Transportation sent out a press release saying that Ride-on Flex is now going to be in service, where you can use your cell phone and help get transportation ride-on options without any particular route to get you from that transportation mass transit node to your home. And so I think what everyone's been saying is correct, that we have traditionally measured half a mile. But the terminology, at least nationally, is shifting to mile. And so whether it is transportation or even with Amazon, everyone keeps saying it's that last mile to the house. We might need to modernize our own thinking in that regard as well. But I look forward again for the homework to figure out some of this data so we can get that right. Thank you.
Councilmember Joando.
Thank you, Council President, and thank you for the great discussion. This was a point that, as my colleagues have mentioned, that we heard a lot from a lot of residents about, and I think we did come to a good compromise, in my view, retaining the current parking requirements for dwellings located more than a mile, but not having that additional requirement for under a mile. And as my colleagues know, I always like to say, and I'd like to state this, have you state this for the record just clearly, for the millions watching at home, Jeff or Pam, could you just state what the current parking requirements are very clearly, and then what the current what would change within under a mile? Could you just state that for the
again? The current parking requirements is for one more parking space than you were required by zoning law, because sometimes 2 parking spaces were required, sometimes 0 parking spaces were required. When you are building a new driveway for a parking space and it didn't exist before, you have to do 2 spaces, because you're eliminating 1 space from the street and adding 1 space.
With the building of the driveway.
So you have to do 2 spaces if you're building a new driveway to do it.
Right.
So that's current.
Current. And then so that for people within 1 mile under the current proposal, you would not have to do that additional space.
You would not have to do that. Whatever parking you have or didn't have was sufficient.
Right. And that's realizing that and based on the generation data that was done by planning, acknowledging that if you're closer to transit, more likelihood that you're going to take it, and we want to encourage that as well. So I just wanted to say that. And then could you talk about also the waiver requirement as well?
of course, it's not a requirement. An applicant can seek a
Or
waiver.
the waiver process, I'm sorry.
Can seek a waiver if they cannot meet the standards of the zone, whatever those standards are.
Right.
And that is a process that goes directly to the hearing examiner. It seems to be fairly short by our standards for administration. It's taking him about 3 weeks. It doesn't require all of the reports that are conditional use reports, and he makes a finding that's appealable to the Board of Appeals if need be, or it's the final decision.
Okay. And I think that's important too, because if for some, Pam, did you want to add something? Go ahead.
The only part I was going to add was, so not only does the applicant have the ability to seek this waiver, it goes hand in hand with the objection process, which allows somebody who's aware of the ADU going into place to say, I'm concerned about the parking ability here and what's going to happen. And so they too can take up this provision, this process, and they can object. It will go to the hearing examiner in the same way the waiver goes to the hearing examiner and take about 3 weeks.
Right. And I think that's important because it's one of the less onerous processes that we have as far as an appeal process, and you don't need a lot of technical information. And we had the hearing examiner before us, or to talk about, or who do we have? I don't know.
Well, the hearing examiner sort of recommended this process,
right,
because he thought it was too burdensome to go through the entire conditional use process.
Right. So I think I just wanted to, for my colleagues' benefit who didn't sit through that, I think we came to a good place. I think Councilmember Glass's point is a good one, and I'm comfortable. I would recommend we stay at the committee recommendation. Thank you.
Councilmember Rice.
Well, thank you very much, Madam President. So mine is more about, of course, as you can imagine, why we just selected Metro Rail and not MARC stations, especially when you consider Germantown MARC Station and what we just did with the MARC Rail Community Sector Plan. And so from that perspective, I would hope that, especially when we look at Boyd's as well, areas like that are very walkable, where people do walk and bike to those MARC Rail stations, where I've now seen our intermediary, as you talk about that last mile, whether it's the e-bikes and others that are out there that are now being left at some of the MARC stations in the Up County. When we look at the ridership on the eastern line of MARC is attributed, half of the ridership comes from Montgomery County. So from that perspective, I do think that it is important for us to consider our MARC stations as well. So I'd just like to hope that we would add that in.
Point. Councilmember Bremer.
Okay, thank you. Great comment, thank you. That was an unfortunate oversight. So I just wanted to mention, going back to this issue of residential permit parking. We heard from some residents about concerns that they have with crowding of their neighborhoods, which is not an ADU issue. It's an issue of the use of existing single-unit homes for rental, or not even rental, just people with a lot of cars. You can have as many cars as you want as a homeowner in Montgomery County, and that is the reality. So you could have a house that has a lot of cars. We did hear from people who live in neighborhoods where they feel that the streets have become overwhelmed, and they want the county to tackle that issue. It's not an ADU issue, but I think we should explore permit parking. Presently, permit parking is restricted to places that are near an institutional use, right? Daytime use. Metro stations, hospitals, things like that. So we're not allowed to create a permit parking program today that is not affected by daytime use. We are limited to daytime use as the rationale for creating a permit program. So we have more exploration to do to see if we could create one that would be more just for a neighborhood that is experiencing a lot of vehicles in the neighborhood. And whether neighborhoods would want that. Some people would, some people wouldn't, but I think it's a worthy topic of conversation, and I certainly intend to continue that dialogue. But it's not specifically an ADU issue. It's really just cars and parking generally. Okay, so I think that. Oh, is there another? Okay, Councilmember Friedson.
Yeah, I just recommend, as a follow-up to the discussion, because I'm not sure that we fully grasp exactly what the residential parking program, permitting program is today. I think it would be helpful to just, I think in writing is fine, but just to clarify for a couple of the colleagues, Councilmember Glass in particular, who raised this issue. I think they're very important issues, ones that we spend a considerable amount of time at committee. I don't know that we need to fully discuss it and flesh it out here, but I just think, if it's okay with the chair, if we could ask Jeff to reach out to DOT just to get that to all of the colleagues, I think that would be helpful. And just to the point that you made, the current standard is really to kind of protect residential communities against commercial businesses, that during the day, or transit. If you live close to transit and somebody would use your residential block as a parking lot, or to use a business and use your residential block as a parking lot. We've never had a residential parking permit that is designed to protect a residential community from itself. And there are residents who are saying, with all due respect to my neighbors, we need that because there are too many cars here for a variety of reasons. This isn't an ADU challenge. This is a broader residential community challenge, and something that I don't think that we can resolve as part of this ZTA, but something that I think we ought to look at. And I think the T&E committee, I think it would be great to look at, because as part of this process and the considerable amount of public input that we received on this, that much larger, somewhat related, but mostly different issue was brought up. And I think it's something that warrants a considerable attention from the committee and ultimately the full council.
Thank you. And actually, I'll share, my office has started to do some work on this issue of, residential permits and things like that. We'll try to share that as well. Okay, I want to do a time check. I think that we will do a hard stop at 12:30, so that everybody can grab lunch and then be back for the afternoon items. So just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. All right, so that takes us through item number 6. And I think from there, I think we ought to jump to item number 9, and then see if we can squeeze in number 8 before 12:30, but probably not. But we'll just see how much discussion interest there is. So item number 9 is, should we grandfather existing accessory structures? And so that is speaking to the possibility that many homes, I think you'll tend to see this more in, older homes, were built with a detached garage. I certainly, when I look around my neighborhood, I see a fair number of remaining attached garages. And some of those could be converted into ADUs. They would not have additional physical impact of a structure on the property because the structure is already there. And so a key provision of the proposal was to allow existing legally built structures, they have to be legally built. It's an important qualification, but to be converted. Speaking speculatively, I think you'll get more of these than you'll likely get brand new ADUs built in the backyard. But that's just my guess based on human nature, I suppose. But this is I think it's just an important item. It may not be a controversial one, but it's an important item. All right, I'll keep going. I think everyone's kind of out of energy is my guess as well. And I am, I know that. I won't take silence as a complete statement, but all right, so the next one is number 8. Can ADUs go in new construction? When the council did this rewrite in 2013, and I should mention if I didn't, that the ADU issue was initially part of the zoning code rewrite, a huge initiative that we took to modernize the zoning code in 2011, 2012.
2014 is when
2014 is when it passed, but we discussed it for decades.
And this was split out from it.
And this was split out from it because it was so controversial, people thought, that we didn't want to jeopardize the whole plan. We split it out, and then we split it up, and we compromised it to the point of, I think, a fatal compromise. One of those was saying that ADUs could not go into new construction, which means that, you know, if you are buy an empty lot, or if you're going to buy a home in a new community and you want to ask the home builder to do a house with a separate ADU, whether in the basement or as a detached, that you could not do that. You would be prohibited from doing that. And I think you see, well, first of all, we have some great examples here in Montgomery County. Councilmember Katz's district, Kentlands, was built. Yeah, so I'll let you speak to that. You know, what an exquisite type of housing it can be when it's done intentionally. But also, you know, it is something that's trending now. And I think it's trending for the same reason that we're here today, that more and more families want to return to this kind of living. Multi-generation living was a norm. It was what families did. You lived together as long as you could because of affordability, because of desirability, child care, care for aging parents. It was just the way that families lived. And that all changed to the detriment, I think, of many people's options and choices 30 years ago with our modern zoning code. And now we're trying to go back to what has been for maybe all of time, a way to create a desirable housing type. Now, as I mentioned before, across the street from me, there is a family with an adult child. She has disabilities. She's a wonderful woman. She has a dog walking business. She lives in the basement. It's not an ADU. I don't know that they'd be allowed to build one. There might be one more close than 300 feet. Next door to them, there's the next family. They have an adult son who lives with them, with his daughter, actually. So there's 3 generations. I think in these cases, an ADU provides it's a better option, or it's an option that they may find to be better, where we're not we're not seeing each other in our bathrobes every morning in the kitchen. You do your thing in your space, and I do my thing in my space, and then we're all sitting around the dinner table together because that's how we want to live. I think that speaks to Councilmember Rice's point about having some separation while you have togetherness, and it's an option that people would love to be able to take advantage of, and presently it's so limited, and so I'm currently living with the concentration impact of 2 of my immediate neighbors with multi-generation living. And I tell you, I think it's an improvement. I think it makes my neighborhood a better place to live. There's more people there. The daughter of my neighbor is my son's schoolmate, and I can get some intel about what's happening at school that my kid won't share with me. And if I had a dog, I might be able to take advantage of the dog walking business. It just makes me feel like I live in a more inclusive community, which is something that is important to me. And I do live in a more inclusive community. So I just think this is a better, it's an enhancement to what people want to be able to do. So that was part of it. So we are in this question of new construction, and I raised that because many families would intentionally like to create that as part of new construction.
All right, Councilmember Albornoz.
Okay. I'm running out of steam. So a couple of thoughts on this. And I agree with a lot of those points, Councilmember Reamer. I do think that there's a lot of validity to your comments. I guess my concern around this relies around 2 issues. One is in my neighborhood and in the neighborhoods immediately adjacent to me, there are a number of properties being purchased by developers and being flipped at a really high rate, and houses are being torn down, and larger homes are being placed on those properties. And so my concern about that, and Councilmember Rice and I talked about it briefly just a moment ago, is and they're flipping them as rental properties to be able to. And obviously having 2 separate homes would make it even more attractive to have 2 separate rental options, because that would mean potentially more income coming in. So there is a provision, that was going to be my question. So there is a provision that would prevent from that as well.
The landowner must live on the site.
Okay.
And really, the owner would have to be the applicant for the license.
Great. So a developer could not flip the properties, turn them over, and then rent them out, and then have two
Right.
separate sources.
Not for two rentals. If he had the owner lined up, and the owner could apply for the license at the time of construction, but he could not rent two separate units.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And then in terms of new development for planned communities, I had a very robust conversation with my colleague, Councilmember Friedson, yesterday about this, and I think he did do a good job advocating for why in new development projects that it does make sense as you purchase going in, going in that there are ADUs not just within your property but others within that area, and we have examples of successful projects like that already in the county. And I guess the concern I had was if you had some of these development projects immediately adjacent to communities that had been there for quite some time, that may create some density issues, but I think the practical reality is there's so little land at this point within the county to develop even moderate amount of homes within a certain area that those alleviated some of my concerns. So and the issue of the flipping of the homes is addressed, I think, by ensuring that the property owner lives in the property.
Right. I'm not sure how DHCA would handle the new development. At what stage does the ultimate owner have to be the signatory on that application? Have you thought about a new development application and who has to be on the application?
Basically, we don't have any of the new developments right now, so we wouldn't have any ideas on that yet. But as far as, people like you're talking about, as far as, builders coming in and doing this, we wouldn't approve the accessory to even move through with permitting until an actual owner is identified, not a company.
But would you stop? I mean, this is a
would stop
little
it.
bit of the problem. Would DPS allow it to go forward without the prospect of a license?
No, I would not. You're talking about one building and an accessory behind it? An accessory? No, it would not, because right now, even
All
if
right,
you
we have to work this one out.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Okay, the question, is it owner occupied?
Not yet. It's not.
Right.
It's a new building.
Right.
So it's not owner occupied yet. At what point would you allow them to do the ADU in a new unit?
Not until the building is completed, and then they can come and apply for an accessory. That
Under
has
the
to
current
be-
code.
Because there is no accessory. I mean, you can't build both of them. I mean, they've got accessories to the main building.
Right,
If
but
there is nothing, how can you get an
If
accessory?
we change the code to allow both an accessory unit and the new unit at the same time, would you then allow it?
Absolutely, if you change
Okay.
the
Well, the,
code.
the structure is legal, it's the use that's the question. So you could build the structure and then.
No, actually, DPS refers to the license process of occupancy in its determination today, is my understanding, about construction even. They go together, but
Absolutely, we work with DHCA. The example I was going to use right now, if you come if you want to have an accessory in the existing building, if I don't have approval from DHCA, we will not issue them the permit.
Right.
So
That's
it's
an
the
important
same
point.
thing. Right.
It's a pretty tight system, and you have to be a good faith applicant here. You can't get a structure without a real license underway.
Okay, all right. You done, Councilmember?
Yes,
Luna?
yes.
Vice President Katz.
Thank you very much. And to me, the new construction, of course, there's a difference between infill, which I guess was to Gabe's concern, but But for instance, in Kentlands, when we developed that, and there was Kentlands cottages. Now, they, in all fairness, were not all necessarily accessory dwelling units. They were separate cottages, and the idea is that some people owned two houses, and in some cases they, that someone bought the one, and the alleys were called muses, or still are called muses, off the Mews, and so it allowed for all of that. But you could have a smaller home, you could, which became a more affordable home. There was parking associated with it. In some cases, they're over the garage, and they attach the garage through a walkway or whatever it was from a second story. There's some people that use those as offices for themselves. There was no requirement that everything had to be, one owner or the separate owner. And I believe we should allow for that. I believe that in those cases, it's actually planned. I mean, that's something that, go ahead,
Yeah, they had an overall density limit.
Absolutely.
And so that was one of the considerations in how they did their basic approval. One of the difference, again, in our ADUs is ownership. The ownership must go with the principal house. This is not a subdivision. You can't just sell the ADU.
Right.
It is part of the single lot, which of course, again, goes to other council members' points that this is limited to those people who are willing to be landlords.
Right.
Personally, that's not my ambition. Some other people might have it as their ambition, but that limits the market of who will take advantage of whatever changes the council makes.
But right now in the county, I would assume that like a Kentlands planned unit development, that type of thing, is it allowed the way the Kentlands would have been built out?
Not exactly in these zones.
But you could create a zone or whatever, and that's what
Sure.
Gaithersburg did. We created a zone for them,
Sure.
so that it could be this way, and so that we could have. So I believe that we should allow for. I mean, I don't know that it necessarily is an accessory dwelling unit, but I believe we should allow for things like that. Though to your point, there's very limited land left, so it's not gonna. We're not gonna have a whole lot of these, but I do think it works. Thanks. And I did want to mention one other thing. Where I live, there's actually duplexes. I live in a single-family home, but we have duplexes that are our neighbors. And you drive past there, and you cannot tell the difference. The only thing you can tell is that one side has a parking driveway, and the other one has on-street parking and a doorway where they walk in. Right behind my home is a duplex. The lady that lives there lives in one. I mean, she didn't have to, but she lives in one, and she bought the other side and rents it out. And you know what? It works just fine. It has not caused any problems whatsoever.
Okay, we have two more lights. We've already reached 12:30, so this has to be very.
I'll be very brief. I'm glad we reiterated the point of the owner occupied, because I think that is key to this. I think it is key to everything about it, because that is what is protecting a lot of the aspect of who's the type of neighbor you would want. Well, certainly if the person who's living in there, that's the type of neighbor they would want. And so I think that's a key point of it. And I think in terms of the this provision, and so the developer switch, flipping is not an issue, although that has been raised and has been thought of as an issue. But I think the larger point to me is the best time, the most cost-effective time, the best time for design, considerations to build an ADU, an accessory structure, is when you're building the principal structure. I mean, so we should be encouraging that. And I think a lot of this is not necessarily just, we're talking about this as the person moves in and immediately wants an ADU. I think a lot of people are going to potentially be building a custom house and have the ability to have a separate walkout entrance that can be converted later on to an ADU as their family ages, including their parents, including their adult age children. And so not allowing that to be part of this and not encouraging that to be part of this just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Thank you so much. So I think we have covered quite a bit. We are going to come back on July 9th. If you were using this list, Councilmember Reamer distributed, we will start at point number 10, and then whatever outstanding issues remain. And then if, I just checked with him, he said 10. But if, it would be great to start getting some of those amendments lined up, so we can see how far we get on the 9th and see if we can then start addressing some of the amendments. We're not going to rush through anything because, as has been illustrated today, there is just a lot to take in and a lot to examine, but that will be the plan for July 9th, okay? And I just also want to say that, as always, in terms of input from residents, we are continually we continue to receive information, we continue to receive questions, we continue to receive feedback. So that still remains as we incorporate all of that into a lot of these decision points. Okay, great. So we'll be back at 1:30. Thank you. And this is a public hearing on Bill 12-19, Human Rights and Civil Liberties, Building Maintenance Worker, Minimum Work Week. This bill will require certain employers in the county to provide certain building maintenance workers with a minimum work week, provide enforcement by the Office of Human Rights and the Human Rights Commission, authorize the Human Rights Commission to award certain relief, and generally regulate the minimum work week for certain workers in the county. An HHS committee work session is tentatively scheduled for Monday, June 24th. Persons wishing to submit additional material for the council's consideration should do so before the close of business, June 19th, so that your views can be included in the material which staff will prepare for the committee's consideration. If you would like to follow the progress of a council bill, the council website has a subscribe function. Go to the council website and use the View Council Records and Legislative Updates link to learn how. And so for our first group, we have James Stowe, Jessica Morales, Alexandra Borges, Miriam Pineda, Marilyn Balcom, and Maria Naranjo. Mr. Stowe is not here? I don't see him. Okay. So we'll start with Jessica Morales, and there's a button at the base of the microphone. Thank you.
Ante todo, buenas tardes.
Above all, good afternoon.
Mi nombre es Jessica Morales, vivo en la ciudad de Germantown y trabajo como limpiadora de oficinas acá en Rockville.
My name is Jessica Morales. I live in Germantown, and I work cleaning offices in Rockville.
Me toca limpiar edificios como el 1600, 1630, 1650 y 1441 de la Research Boulevard.
I have to clean buildings such as 1600, 1630, 1650, and 1441 on Research Boulevard.
Aparte de eso, soy madre soltera, tengo 4 niños, tengo un niño discapacitado que me toca cuidar de él.
Besides that, I'm a single mother with 4 children, one of them disabled, whom I have to take care of.
Y así como están las cosas, pues pienso que un trabajo de tiempo completo nos beneficiaría a todas las madres como yo.
And given how hard things are, I think that a full-time job would benefit all of us single mothers.
A veces cuando vienen los biles, me toca pensar y saber cómo voy a hacer porque un trabajo part-time no es muy suficiente para mí o para las otras madres.
When bills come, I struggle thinking how I'm going to do it to pay all those bills because a part-time job is not enough for people like me and for other mothers like me.
Mi motivación para luchar por un horario completo es la única manera en que mejoraría mi situación.
So I'm very motivated to fight for a full-time job. I see it as the only solution to overcome all these obstacles.
Ahora mismo tengo que usar el Medicaid.
Right now, I use Medicaid.
Pero si tuviéramos un tiempo completo, sería mejor porque nuestro empleador nos proporcionaría un plan de salud.
But if we had a full-time job, that would be better because then we would get a paid health insurance through our employer.
Creo que como madre de 4 hijos, creo que merecemos, pues trabajamos muy duro y en labores agobiantes.
And I think as a mother of 4 children, we deserve something like that because we work very hard doing very, very hard jobs.
Le rogamos, me gustaría que por favor nos ayudarían a que la ley de tiempo completo se nos diera.
So I ask you, I beg you, I ask you to please consider this bill a full-time job bill would really help us.
Gracias por su tiempo.
Thank you for your time.
Muchas gracias. Alexandra Burgos. Hay un botón ahí en la base. Ajá.
Muy buena tarde.
Good afternoon.
Mi nombre es Alexandra Burgos.
My name is Alexandra Burgos.
Soy trabajadora de limpieza de Silver Spring, Maryland.
¿De dónde? Silver Spring, dijo?
Silver Spring, Maryland.
Okay, so I work as a janitor in Silver Spring.
Estamos aquí porque muchos de nosotros estamos luchando porque nuestro trabajo solo es de medio tiempo.
We're here because many of us are struggling because our jobs are only part-time.
Es muy difícil para mí porque tengo que cuidar a mi esposo que está enfermo.
It's particularly hard for me because I have to take care also of my husband who is sick.
Esto significa que no puedo tomar un segundo empleo.
This means I can't take a second job.
Pero un horario de tiempo completo me haría de mucha diferencia.
But a full-time job would make a great difference.
Como por ejemplo, me permitiría cuidar a mi esposo y me ayudaría económicamente.
For example, it would allow me to take care of my husband and it would help me economically, financially.
Y lo más importante, que podría tener un seguro de salud pagado por el empleador.
Most importantly, I would be able to have health insurance paid for by my employer.
Porque en estos momentos no tengo seguro médico.
Right now, I don't have medical insurance.
En ocasiones tengo que ir a la República Dominicana para ver a mi médico.
On occasions, I have to go to the Dominican Republic to see a doctor.
No sé qué pasará si tengo alguna emergencia en este país.
I don't know what would happen if I had an emergency in this country.
Mi esposo es discapacitado y no puede trabajar.
My husband is disabled and he can't work.
Y hay que pagar nuestra factura y con un horario de medio completo me es imposible.
We have to pay for our bills, and with a part-time job, it's impossible.
Mi esposo es veterano militar de los Estados Unidos.
My husband is a U.S. veteran.
Y merece esta lucha.
And he deserves better than this struggle.
Yo sé que muchos de ustedes también están pasando por lo mismo.
I know that many of you are going through the same thing.
Y por eso me uno a la 32BJ para apoyar el full time. Muchísimas gracias.
And that's why I joined 32BJ in support of a full-time job. Thank you.
Gracias, señora Burgos. Miriam Pineda.
Mi nombre es Miriam Pineda. Buenas tardes.
My name is Miriam Pineda. Good afternoon.
No, ya la apagaste.
No, tiene que estar en rojo.
Tiene que prenderla, ahí está.
A ver, ya está prendido. Soy una madre soltera. El único sustento para mis nietos que viven conmigo, pero es extremadamente difícil si solo trabajamos medio tiempo.
I am a single mother and also the single support for my grandchildren, and it's very hard to do working part-time.
Es muy difícil porque ya soy una persona de mayor edad. Estoy atrasada en mis pagos por solo tener part-time. No tenemos seguro médico.
It's hard for me because I only work part-time and I'm an older person, and it's also difficult because we don't have health insurance.
No me puedo hacer un chequeo por no tener los beneficios.
I'm not able to have checkups because I don't have health benefits.
Necesito además hacerme pruebas para ver si tenemos cáncer. He puesto mi fe en Dios para conseguir seguro de salud.
I need to have cancer tests, but so far all I've been able to do is put my faith in God since we don't have health insurance.
Me hace feliz de pensar cómo se beneficiarían mis colegas de trabajo con esta ley.
It makes me happy to think how my colleagues, my coworkers would benefit if we were able to have this bill pass.
Un horario de tiempo completo representaría un mundo de diferencia.
A full-time job would make a world of difference.
Significaría que tendríamos más dinero para ayudar a poner al día mis cuentas y brindar estabilidad y salud, claro. Muchas gracias.
It would mean that it would provide for more money to help me pay for my bills and to provide stability for my family and to have health insurance. Thank you.
Gracias, señora Pineda. Marilyn Balcom.
Madam President, council members, my name is Marilyn Balcom with the Gaithersburg Germantown Chamber of Commerce. We have great concerns with Bill 1219. While this bill will have positive impacts for some employees, it will have many more negative impacts. Every piece of literature you read on creating family-friendly workplace suggests that offering part-time schedules is one of the easiest, most effective ways an employer can support employees and their families. This legislation is the complete opposite of the general trend towards more family-friendly policies. By requiring full-time schedules, this legislation takes Montgomery County backwards. Employers are no longer able to offer this choice benefit. More importantly, affected employees will no longer have the choice of working less than 30 hours a week. There will clearly be winners and losers with this legislation. Impacted businesses will restructure their operations and fewer people will be employed. It's basic math. If it takes 600 hours to clean a building, that's how long it takes. This bill doesn't change that. So if a cleaning contractor has 30 employees working 20 hours a week to clean a building, this legislation will change that complement to 20 employees working 30 hours a week. That may be great for the people whose hours are increased, but not so great for the people who lose their jobs. There are many industries that use part-time staff as a legitimate function of their operations. If the real motivation behind this bill is to make health care more accessible to people working part-time, the parameters of this bill seem arbitrary. This bill unfairly targets one specific industry, asking them to pay employees for more hours than is operationally necessary. If this bill was applied to all part-time workers in the county, including your staff, you would no longer be able to hire part-time employees, regardless of whether that was the best scenario for your office. We fundamentally do not believe that the county should have functional control over how many hours a private employer is required to pay a private employee if there's no operational reason to do so. I encourage you to vote no on this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to, Maria Naranjo.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Council President Navarro and council members. My name is Maria Naranjo. I am the Deputy Director and longtime union activist for 26 years, living here in Montgomery County and been working with janitorial workers in Montgomery County, Washington, D.C., and Maryland. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Our union represents 20,000 property services workers in this area, from janitors to security officers to airport workers, and we represent the vast majority of commercial office cleaners here in Montgomery County. One policy challenge facing America right now is how we transform our economy into one that delivers for working people. It is our belief that every level of government has a role to play, and now more than ever, local government can step up and take the lead. This bill is an example of smart and effective local leadership. By setting a minimum work week of 30 hours for building service workers, this bill will establish a local industry standard that helps to improve workers' economic security. It will mean that more workers will get health care. It will mean that more workers will get better paychecks. It will mean that more workers, like these sisters next to me, won't have to work two jobs. They could have one good full-time job and, frankly, spend more time with their families. We know that the building service work can be structured to provide full-time jobs, and I have personal experience about this in Washington, D.C., where a similar law came into effect in 2017. With that law, 475 previously part-time workers became full-time in buildings covered by our collective bargaining agreement shortly after the law was implemented in D.C. The change was astounding. Workers gained health care and received a monthly increase of between $300 and $900 more a month because they went full-time. Building service workers in Montgomery County deserve the same opportunity. We also know that this bill will reduce turnover in the buildings that it covers. We know that more part-time workers have a higher rate of turnover, 37% according to our statistics and our research of part-time workers turnover as compared to 13% of full-time. We ask all of you to stand with the workers and the janitors and the cleaners of Montgomery County, and please support this bill in order to give our families and these sisters and all the thousands of workers that we represent a good full-time job. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to move on to Group B. Christopher De Lorenzo, Leo Gertner, Brian Folger, Kamolika Das. We'll begin with Christopher De Lorenzo. Press the button, please. Thank you.
Oh, great.
It's
Okay.
done.
Good afternoon, Madam President, council members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this afternoon. My name is Chris De Lorenzo. I'm representing the Greater Bethesda Chamber of Commerce, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact that this bill would have on me and people like me. I am a PhD student at Georgetown University, and I work at Capital Concierge as a part-time on-call concierge. And I'm working to support myself while I finish my degree. And I'm not in a position to work full-time because I have a dissertation to write. So I just want to make clear that, I want to finish this degree so that I can contribute to my community. And this bill would make it impossible for me to work part-time in my current capacity. So I'm urging the council to vote no on this bill. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Leo Gertner, please press the button at the base there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Council President Navarro, members of the Montgomery County Council for the opportunity to submit testimony today. My name is Leo Gertner. I'm a staff attorney at the National Employment Law Project. NELP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization specializing in employment policy. We're based in New York with offices in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country. We partner with federal, state, and local lawmakers on a wide range of workforce issues, including minimum employment standards. We testify in strong support of Bill 1219 as a high cost of living county and a high cost of living state. Montgomery County workers must work extremely hard to survive and sustain their families. That challenge is made worse when they are not scheduled to work enough hours to bring home paychecks that cover their basic costs and that deprive them of health benefits. Involuntary part-time hampers the goal of creating an equitable and sustainable economy for all workers. Research has shown that Montgomery County lags behind other comparable markets in terms of the proportion of industry workers at full-time hours. Insufficient and unreliable hours cause income volatility for workers and therefore instability for families. Meanwhile, Montgomery County boasts a competitive real estate market that can easily absorb the modest labor cost increases that the bill would cause. A mere 2 cents per square foot per month. The savings to the Montgomery Cares program and its employers due to reduced turnover costs and increased productivity more than justify these changes. We believe this bill provides a reasonable and equitable way to fix that for a portion of the building maintenance workforce in the county in a way that is manageable and even beneficial for employers in the county. We urge the council to approve the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Folger.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Folger. I'm the chairman of Folger Pratt. We are a Montgomery County-based real estate investment and development company. We've been in business for 55 years. I was counting up, I think we've developed or owned about 24 office buildings here in Montgomery County, but we are also doing work all over the region and in California and Utah. I'm also a member of AYOBA, and I want to endorse everything that Marilyn Balcom had to say. I thought the points she made were relevant and important. This bill that you're considering will result in increased operating costs for the buildings that are being targeted, putting further pressure on rental rates and occupancy costs in a county. Rising rents and/or rising expenses lead to a competitive disadvantage for the few properties that are being targeted by this legislation. Those higher costs, increasing the minimum work week to 30 hours, if passed, we try to pass through to our tenants, but the impact that that has is that can affect their decisions and choices as to where they locate. We project that the bill would add approximately 10 to 15% to our cleaning costs and also increase our utility expenses because the buildings have to be lit and ventilated later in the night. These buildings and these tenants will be facing increased costs of occupancy with no change in services, amenities, or building features or condition. As a company that operates in multiple jurisdictions throughout the DC and Maryland area, we're aware of the choices that tenants make and how they make those decisions. As an example, we purchased the Discovery Building and now the Aventa Towers. And gratefully, we were able to sign a lease recently with Children's Hospital for 140,000 square feet, which we're very pleased with. But we are now working very hard to lease the balance of that building, of a 550,000 square foot building. And in the face of increased operating expenses, that becomes more difficult. We're doing that in a county with an office vacancy rate of nearly 17%, and the suburban Maryland job market is as weak as we've ever seen it, accounting last year for only about 8.5% of the total job growth in the DC area, as opposed to its historical norm of about 25%. Lower operating expenses and the overall cost of occupancy are very important factors to prospective tenants who could elect to lease space in another building in our area or in another part of our region. A time of weak job growth and weak office market is not the time to increase our costs and negatively impact our competitive position. Thank you.
Thank you. Kamalika Das.
Council President Navarro and members of the council, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Kamalika Das, and I'm a policy analyst at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. DCFPI is a nonprofit organization that promotes budget choices to address DC's economic and racial inequities through independent research and policy recommendations. I'm here today to express DCFPI's strong support for this bill. In 2016, DC passed a very similar Building Services Act that requires employers to provide minimum hours to building service employees. The majority of the work must be delegated to employees who are guaranteed a minimum of 30 hours or more. This bill also covers net office spaces with a minimum of 350,000 square feet of rentable space. Since 2016, this bill has had zero or minimal impact on DC's office market, evidenced by the fact that DC's office market continues to thrive. Overall office vacancy rates declined from the end of last year to the first quarter of 2019, currently 13.3%, with nearly 4 million square feet set to deliver in 2019 alone. If we take a longer view, there's been a slight uptick in the vacancy rate since 2016, but the general consensus is that this increase is due to an increase in supply rather than a decline in demand, a sign that developers are still looking to build in DC. This is further emphasized by the fact that new leasing activity has been particularly strong. In the first quarter of 2019, nearly 1.66 million square feet of new leases have been signed, well over the 10-year quarterly average. To quote the DC Business Improvement District 2018 report, development interest in downtown DC was at near record levels with 17 projects under construction. Investment interest was also very high, with near record investment in all classes of office buildings. It's also important to note that given the 350,000 square feet minimum requirement, this bill would only impact 34 buildings in Montgomery County, not smaller buildings or small retailers. For comparison, WeWork's expansion at Metropolitan Square was the largest expansion in DC in the past 5 years and was less than 118,000 square feet. DC's City Hall, the John A. Wilson building where I spend a lot of my time, is less than half this size. An analysis of DC's Maryland suburbs shows that small and mid-sized tenants have been making a large portion of new leases. The analysis further states that Montgomery County's declining vacancy rate trend should quote unquote continue as the desire for suburban and urban infill locations shows no sign of slowing. While this bill would have significant positive impact on employees whose weekly hours are increased from 20 to 30 hours per week, the increase in cost to building owners are minuscule. The estimated increase costs, I'm sorry, can I have 10 more seconds?
Finish your sentence,
Okay.
please.
Is only 2 cents per square foot. So basically, this additional cost is 0.05% of the total $40.40 per square foot,
Thank you.
or 1/2000th of their monthly costs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, we do have a light. Councilmember Jawando.
Thank you, Council President, and thank you, everyone, for your testimony. Mr. Folger, good to see you. I used to work in the Discovery Building. Keep leasing it out, please. Do the best you can. Do you have DC property that's similarly situated?
We don't have
Office build. Okay, I didn't.
You press your button so we can hear you.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
sorry. No, we don't have office space. We have
Okay.
multifamily.
So we couldn't compare the cost, but and then to Mrs. Das, is that right, Ms. Das? The increase seen in DC, you said it was minimal, and actually you think it's more of a supply-demand issue than it is related to the cost of increasing pay for the employees.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here today. All right, so we're now on to item number 11. 10? 10. There's an 11 here. This is a public hearing on Bill 13-19, County Property Disposition Reuse Analyses. This bill would modify the procedures for disposition of county property, require the executive to submit a reuse analysis to the council, and generally amend the county law regarding disposition of county property. A GO committee work session is tentatively scheduled for Thursday, June 27th. Persons wishing to submit additional material for the council's consideration should do so before the close of business, June 24th, so that your views can be included in the material which staff will prepare for the committee's consideration. We have one person signed to testify, Mr. Assad.
Good afternoon. Greg Osson, Department of General Services, testifying on behalf of the county executive. Bill 1319 would modify the procedures for disposition of county property and require the executive to submit the reuse analysis to the county council. The county executive was a co-sponsor of the amendments to the county's disposition of real property regulations in 2012. The amendments from 2012 obligate the county executive to provide pertinent information to the county council when seeking to surplus county-owned real estate. As a council member, the county executive co-sponsored the legislation to ensure transparency and a higher level of scrutiny when considering the disposition of public land. The county executive supports Bill 1319 and the amendments to the regulations as they further promote transparency. As you have noted in the analysis from the Office of Management and Budget, there is little or no cost associated with Bill 1319 as the information is prepared as a matter of course. As such, the county executive has no concerns with the operational impacts of the bill or providing the reuse analysis for future property disposition matters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that brings our public hearings to an end. And so now I do have a proposed closed session to discuss appointment, employment, assignment, promotion, discipline, demotion, compensation, removal, resignation, or performance evaluation of appointees, employees, or officials over whom it has jurisdiction pursuant to Maryland Code State Government Article 3-305B1I. The topic is planning board appointment. Is there a motion? Moved by Councilmember Reamer. Is there a second? I'm sorry, Councilmember Hucker. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Thank you, and we'll be in closed session right next door.